The sun dipped low over the city skyline, casting an orange glow across the bustling parking lot of an upscale restaurant. David Kingston, a self-made millionaire, adjusted his tailored suit as he approached his sleek, black sports car. The hum of distant traffic and muffled conversations served as white noise for his busy mind. As he unlocked the car, a gruff voice called out from behind him, "Don't drive that car. Your wife cut the brakes." David froze, his hand hovering over the driver's side door. He turned to see the source of the voice, a scruffy, unshaven man in his late 40s, wearing a tattered jacket and jeans that had seen better days. The man looked out of place amid the polished vehicles and well-dressed patrons. "Excuse me?" David said, his tone sharp, laced with disbelief. The man stepped closer, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I know it sounds crazy, but you can't get in that car. Something's wrong with the brakes. I saw her, your wife, tampering with it earlier." David's eyes narrowed as he scanned the man. Homeless, probably. Just another con artist looking for an angle. "And why should I believe you?" "I'm Jake," the man stammered. "Look, I know how it sounds, but I was sheltering in the parking garage earlier. I saw her under the car with a pair of cutters. I swear." Before David could respond, another voice interrupted. "David, what's going on here?" David turned to see his wife, Lila, approaching. Her heels clicked against the pavement, and her designer handbag swung casually at her side. She looked every bit the polished, elegant woman he had fallen for years ago. "Who is this?" she asked, her tone icy as her gaze shifted to Jake. "Apparently, he thinks you've been tampering with my car," David said, his voice skeptical but tinged with curiosity. Lila's laughter rang out, light and dismissive. "Tampering with your car? That's ridiculous." She turned to Jake, her expression shifting from amusement to contempt. "Listen, I don't know who you are, but you need to leave before I call security." Jake stood his ground, his eyes darting between the couple. "I'm telling the truth. Check the car if you don't believe me." David hesitated, caught between the absurdity of the accusation and a nagging sense that something felt off. He glanced at Lila, who met his gaze with a perfectly calm smile. Too calm, he thought. "Fine," David said, pulling out his phone. "I'll humor this for a moment. Let's call someone to take a look." Lila's smile faltered ever so slightly, but she quickly recovered. "David, this is a waste of time. Let's just go. He's probably trying to scam you." Jake took a step forward. "If I'm lying, you'll know soon enough. But if I'm not, you're risking your life by ignoring me." David stared at Jake, then at Lila. The tension between the three of them hung in the air like an invisible weight. "All right," David said finally. "We'll check the car." As Jake let out a sigh of relief, Lila's expression tightened, her composed demeanor beginning to crack. And in that moment, David realized he might not know his wife as well as he thought. David handed his car key to the valet supervisor, a young man with a nervous smile. "Get someone to inspect the brakes immediately," he instructed. The supervisor nodded and hurried off, leaving the three standing in strained silence. Lila folded her arms across her chest, her designer watch glinting in the dim light. "David, this is absurd. You're letting a random stranger dictate our evening." David turned to her, his jaw tight. "If it's absurd, it won't take long to prove. You seem awfully eager to move on, though." Lila's eyes flared briefly before she masked her irritation. "I just don't like wasting time on nonsense." Jake, meanwhile, stood quietly to the side, his shoulders tense and his gaze darting nervously around the lot. "I'm telling you, you'll thank me for this," he mumbled. "Let's hope so," David replied flatly. The valet returned with a mechanic in tow, a stout man with grease-streaked hands and a toolbox clinking at his side. "You wanted me to take a look at the brakes?" "Yes," David said, stepping back to give the man room. "I want to make sure there's nothing wrong with the car." The mechanic nodded, dropping to one knee as he peered under the vehicle. The sound of tools scraping metal punctuated the awkward silence. Lila tapped her foot impatiently while Jake watched intently, his fingers twitching nervously. After what felt like an eternity, the mechanic emerged, his expression grim. He held up a severed brake line, the clean cut unmistakable. This isn't wear and tear, he said, his voice firm. This was cut deliberately. David's stomach churned. He stared at the frayed line in disbelief. Are you sure? The mechanic nodded. Absolutely. You're lucky this was caught before you drove off. It could have been deadly. David's gaze shifted to Lila, whose face had gone pale. She quickly forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. That doesn't prove anything. Anyone could have done that, maybe even him. She pointed at Jake, her voice rising. Jake took a step back, his hands raised defensively. I didn't touch your car. I only saw her under it. That's why I said something. David held up a hand to stop the escalating argument. Enough. His voice was calm, but carried an edge of authority. Lila, let's not jump to conclusions. You're seriously considering his word over mine? Lila snapped, her carefully polished composure cracking. David studied her closely. Something about her reaction didn't sit right. I'm considering all possibilities, he said carefully. Lila huffed, throwing up her hands. Fine. Believe what you want. She turned on her heel, her heels clicking furiously as she stormed toward the restaurant. Jake shifted uneasily, watching her go. You see what I mean? She's hiding something. David's jaw clenched. I don't know what's going on yet, but you were right to warn me. Thank you. Jake nodded, but looked more cautious than triumphant. Look, I don't want to get involved in your personal life, but someone's clearly out to hurt you. David ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Why would she do this? It doesn't make sense. Jake hesitated before speaking. Sometimes it's not about logic. People can hide a lot behind a pretty face. David glanced toward the restaurant, where Lila had disappeared. The doubt he'd been trying to suppress for months began to claw its way to the surface. You said you saw her under the car, David said, his tone sharper now. What exactly did you see? Jake shifted uncomfortably. I didn't see her face, but I saw a woman dressed like her. She was crouched under your car with some kind of tool. When she stood up, she looked like her, but I didn't get a clear view. David's brows furrowed. Not clear enough to be sure? Jake nodded reluctantly. I can't swear on it, but, he trailed off, glancing toward the parking garage exit. But what? Jake's voice dropped to a near whisper. It felt wrong. Like she knew someone might be watching but didn't care. David exhaled heavily, feeling the weight of suspicion grow. Jake, if I gave you a chance to prove you're more than just a bystander in all this, would you take it? Jake blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? I mean, I need someone who can think like a mechanic and doesn't mind digging into things others might overlook, David said. His voice hardened. Because I think this goes deeper than just cut brakes. Jake hesitated, but nodded slowly. If it helps keep you alive, I'm in. David extended a hand, and Jake shook it firmly. Good, David said, his tone resolute. Let's figure out what the hell is going on. David and Jake stood in the dimly lit parking lot, the tension between them palpable. David's mind raced, a storm of questions pounding in his head. If Lila really had tampered with the brakes, what was her motive? And if Jake wasn't entirely sure he'd seen her, was this all some elaborate mistake? Let's start simple, David said, his voice low but firm. Tell me everything you know, Jake. Start from the beginning. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering to the luxury cars surrounding them. All right. I was staying in the parking garage last night. It's warmer than the streets, and most security guards don't check past midnight. He paused, gauging David's reaction. Go on, David prompted, his tone neutral. I was tucked away in the corner, by the utility room, Jake continued. I couldn't sleep, so I walked around the lot to stretch my legs. That's when I saw her, or someone who looked like her, kneeling by your car. She was quick, like she knew what she was doing. David frowned. Did you see anyone else? Jake shook his head. No one. Just her. She left in a hurry, and I didn't think much of it until I overheard some valets talking about you arriving tonight. That's when it clicked. And you decided to confront me, David said, rubbing his temples. Jake shrugged. What else was I supposed to do? Let you drive off and hope for the best? David appreciated Jake's honesty, even if the story raised more questions than it answered. If you're lying to me, I'll find out, he warned. Jake held his hands up. I've got no reason to lie. I'm just trying to help. David stared at him for a long moment before nodding. All right, let's dig deeper. Inside the restaurant, Lila sat at a corner table, a glass of red wine in her perfectly manicured hand. Her calm exterior belied the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. She had seen David and Jake talking before she left, and the fact that he hadn't immediately dismissed the homeless man unnerved her. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at the screen. A single text message lit up. Is it done? Lila's fingers hovered over the screen, her heart pounding. She quickly locked the phone, hiding the message as David entered the restaurant. He approached the table, his face unreadable. We need to talk, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. Lila set her glass down, her expression carefully composed. What about? David leaned forward, lowering his voice. The brakes on my car were cut, and the mechanic confirmed it wasn't an accident. Lila feigned shock, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh my God, David. Who would do something like that? David didn't answer immediately. He studied her, searching for any sign of deception. That's what I'm trying to figure out, he said finally. Lila reached across the table, placing a hand on his. I can't believe this. Do you think it could be someone from your work? You've mentioned rivals before. David shook his head slowly. I don't know, but I have to be careful. Someone clearly wants me dead. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Lila withdrew her hand, her expression somber. Maybe we should get out of the city for a while, she suggested. Take some time away from everything. David raised an eyebrow. That's sudden. I'm worried about you, Lila said, her voice soft but insistent. Whoever did this might try again. It's not safe here. David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You're right about one thing. It's not safe. But I'm not running away. Not until I know who's behind this. Lila hesitated, her mask of concern flickering for just a moment. Of course. Whatever you think is best. David nodded, his suspicions growing. I've got someone helping me look into it, he added casually, watching her reaction. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Who? A guy named Jake. He's a mechanic, David lied smoothly. He's got experience with this kind of thing. Lila forced a smile. That's good. I'm glad you're being proactive. But as David watched her sip her wine, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Back in the parking lot, Jake waited near the car, his breath visible in the cool night air. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. He had no idea who David's wife really was, but one thing was clear. She wasn't as innocent as she appeared. A sudden movement caught his attention. A figure slipped into the shadows near the edge of the lot, their presence barely perceptible. Jake's instincts kicked in. He ducked behind a nearby car, his pulse quickening. Whoever it was, they weren't here by accident. David hesitated. The thought had crossed his mind, but saying it out loud felt like crossing a line he wasn't ready to confront. I don't know, he admitted finally, but something's not adding up. Jake nodded grimly. You need to be careful. If she's part of this, she's not going to make it easy for you to figure it out. David exhaled, his breath visible in the chilly air. Let's focus on facts. What's our next move? Jake thought for a moment before replying. We need to know who that guy was. He might lead us to whoever's behind this. And how do you suggest we do that? David asked, his skepticism clear. Jake smirked faintly. You've got money, right? People talk for the right price. Especially valets and security guards. David considered the idea. It wasn't his style to bribe people, but desperate times called for desperate measures. All right, he said. Let's start with the security footage. If there's a camera in the lot, it might have caught him. The two men made their way to the parking garage office, where a lone security guard sat behind a desk cluttered with coffee cups and newspapers. The man looked up as they entered, his face tired but curious. Can I help you? He asked. David stepped forward, slipping a crisp $100 bill onto the desk. We need to see the footage from the last hour. The guard's eyes flicked to the money, and after a brief hesitation, he nodded. All right, but keep it quick. I'm not supposed to do this. He turned to the monitor and began scrolling through the footage. David and Jake leaned over his shoulder, their eyes scanning the grainy black and white images. "There," Jake said, pointing to a figure moving near David's car. The guard froze the frame and zoomed in, but the figure's face was partially obscured by a hood. "Can you rewind to when they arrived?" David asked. The guard complied, going back several minutes until the figure entered the lot. This time, they caught a clearer view of the car, a dark sedan with no license plate. "Great," David muttered, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Jake squinted at the screen. "Wait, can you go back again? There's something about the way they move." The guard rewound the footage, and Jake leaned closer. "I've seen that guy before. He's been hanging around downtown lately, near the shelters." He crept closer, his heart pounding, and caught a glimpse of the figure pulling out a phone. Jake strained to hear as the person spoke in hushed tones. "It's not over yet. I'll make sure of it." Jake's blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they weren't just an observer. They were part of whatever sinister plan had put David in danger. He waited until the figure disappeared into the night before emerging from his hiding spot. "I've got to tell him," Jake muttered to himself. But as he headed toward the restaurant to warn David, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Inside the restaurant, David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at Lila, who was now staring into her wine glass, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he said, standing and stepping toward a quieter corner. He pulled out his phone to see a text from Jake. "Someone's here." They were in the parking lot, talking on the phone. Said, "It's not over yet. Be careful." David's grip on the phone tightened. A chill ran down his spine as he reread the message. If Jake was right, someone wasn't just sabotaging his car, they were actively watching him. He turned back toward the table, finding Lila scrolling through her phone, her face bathed in the glow of the screen. Her nonchalance struck him as almost too perfect. Sliding his phone into his pocket, David returned to his seat. "I need to step outside for a moment," he said, his tone deliberately casual. Lila looked up, her brow furrowing. "Is everything all right?" "Just a work call," David lied, offering a reassuring smile. "I'll be quick." Without waiting for a response, he walked out of the restaurant, his steps purposeful. He spotted Jake standing near a dark corner of the parking lot, partially hidden by shadows. Jake approached him quickly. "The guy left about 10 minutes ago." I couldn't get a clear look at his face, but he sounded serious. "What else did you hear?" David asked, his voice low. "Not much," Jake admitted. "Just that one line. But whoever it was, they weren't here to admire the cars." David's mind raced. Was this connected to the brakes? Or was there another layer to this conspiracy? Jake glanced around nervously. "You think your wife's involved, don't you?" David turned to him sharply. "Are you sure?" Jake nodded. "Positive. He's not homeless like me, though. He's different. Talks like he's working for someone." David straightened, his mind spinning. This wasn't just a random act of sabotage, it was planned. And if Jake recognized the man, they might have a lead. "Thanks," David said to the guard, sliding another bill across the desk. The guard pocketed it quickly, waving them off. "You didn't get this from me." As they left the office, David turned to Jake. "If you've seen him downtown, can you find him again?" Jake nodded. "Probably, but it'll take time." "Do it," David said, his tone firm, "and let me know the moment you do." Jake hesitated. "You sure you can trust your wife while we figure this out?" David glanced toward the restaurant, where Lila was still waiting. "That's what I'm about to find out." With that, he strode back toward the building, his mind made up. If Lila had anything to do with this, he needed proof. And if she didn't, then someone else was playing a dangerous game. David returned to the restaurant, his face composed but his mind a whirlwind of suspicions. Lila greeted him with a warm smile, yet something about her demeanor felt practiced, almost rehearsed. "You were gone a while," she said, swirling her wine. "Work stuff," David replied, slipping back into his seat. "Nothing too urgent, but it took longer than I expected." Lila tilted her head, studying him with a curious glint in her eyes. "You've been so distracted lately. Are you sure everything's okay?" David hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think I've just been under a lot of stress. There's been strange stuff happening." She leaned forward, concern softening her features. Strange how. David decided to probe. For starters, the brakes on my car were tampered with. I could have been killed. Lila gasped, her hand flying to her chest. David, that's awful. Do you have any idea who would do something like that? Her reaction was perfect, too perfect. David watched her closely, noting every flicker of emotion. Was she genuinely shocked? Or was this an act? I'm working on it, he said evenly. I've spoken to a few people, and I think I'll have answers soon. Lila reached across the table, taking his hand. Please be careful. I can't bear the thought of losing you. Her touch was warm, her concern seemingly genuine, but the text message he'd seen earlier played on a loop in his mind. Is it done? Was it possible she was living a double life, hiding sinister intentions beneath her polished facade? Don't worry, David said, pulling his hand away. I'm always careful. After dinner, David offered to drive Lila home, using the spare car he kept at their townhouse. She accepted, her demeanor relaxed, but David's thoughts were anything but. As they drove, Lila's phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced at it quickly before sliding it back inside, her expression unreadable. Who was that? David asked casually. Just a reminder for an appointment tomorrow, she replied without missing a beat. David didn't press further, but his instincts told him there was more to the story. When they arrived home, Lila headed upstairs to change, leaving David alone in the living room. He took the opportunity to search for clues. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, slightly open. He hesitated for a moment, guilt creeping in, but pushed it aside. He needed answers. Carefully, he opened the purse and retrieved her phone. The screen required a passcode. David sighed, returning it to its place just as he heard Lila coming down the stairs. What are you doing? She asked, her tone light but probing. Just grabbing a drink, David said, holding up a glass of water. Lila smiled faintly. I'm going to bed. It's been a long day. David nodded. I'll join you in a bit. That night, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Lila slept beside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying next to a stranger. Her breathing was steady, her face peaceful, but the doubts in his mind refused to rest. Was she capable of something so cruel, so calculated? Or was he letting paranoia cloud his judgment? His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. He grabbed it quickly, careful not to wake her. It was a message from Jake. I think I found him. Downtown near the old station. Want me to follow? David replied immediately. Don't engage. Just keep an eye on him. I'll be there soon. Slipping out of bed, David dressed quietly, his movements precise. As he left the room, he glanced back at Lila one last time. If she was guilty, this night might change everything. Downtown, the streets were dark and quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional passing car. Jake stood near the entrance of an abandoned station, his hood pulled low. There, Jake whispered, pointing toward a man leaning against a brick wall, smoking a cigarette. David recognized him immediately from the security footage. The man's posture was casual, but his eyes scanned the area like he was expecting trouble. What do we do? Jake asked, his voice barely audible. We wait, David replied. Let's see who he talks to. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the cold air biting at their skin. Finally, another figure approached, a tall, well-dressed man who exuded confidence. The two exchanged words, their conversation too quiet to hear from a distance. Then the well-dressed man handed the other a small envelope before walking away. David's mind raced. Who was this second man? And what was in the envelope? Follow him, David whispered to Jake, nodding toward the man with the envelope. What about you? Jake asked. I'll follow the other one, David replied, already moving toward the well-dressed man. As David trailed his target through the shadowed streets, his heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. This was his chance to uncover the truth, to find out who was behind the sabotage, and if Lila was involved. But as the man disappeared into a sleek black car and drove off, David realized something chilling. Whoever this was, they weren't just an enemy. They were powerful, and they weren't going to stop until David's life was completely unraveled. David returned to his car, gripping the wheel tightly as he replayed the night's events in his mind. The sleek black car that had whisked the well-dressed man away was untraceable for now, but the envelope exchange had deepened his suspicions. Someone powerful was orchestrating this, and the stakes were rising. His phone buzzed. It was Jake again. He went into a bar. "I'm inside now, keeping an eye on him." David quickly typed back, "Stay there. Don't let him see you. I'm on my way." The bar Jake had mentioned was tucked into a poorly lit street corner, the neon sign flickering faintly in the night. David parked a block away and walked cautiously toward the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was dim and smoky. A jukebox hummed a faint tune in the corner, and a handful of patrons nursed their drinks at scattered tables. Jake sat at the bar, his back turned to the man he was watching. Jake gave David a small nod as he approached. "He's at the table near the back," Jake murmured without looking up, pretending to sip from his glass of water. David glanced subtly toward the target. The man sat hunched over the table, flipping through the contents of the envelope. David caught a glimpse of what looked like photographs and documents. "Can you see what he's got?" David whispered. Jake shook his head. "Not from here. But he's been looking at those papers like they're the most important thing in the world." David considered his options. Approaching the man directly was risky, but if he left with those documents, it might be their only chance to understand what was happening. "Stay here," David said. "If he moves, text me." Jake frowned. "What are you gonna do?" "Improvise." David walked to the other side of the bar, keeping the man in his peripheral vision. He flagged down the bartender and ordered a drink, striking up casual conversation. "You get a lot of regulars in here?" David asked, glancing toward the man at the back table. The bartender followed his gaze, then shrugged. "Depends. Him? Never seen him before." David nodded thoughtfully, his instincts telling him this man was here for a specific reason. He leaned closer to the bartender. "What about the guy he met outside earlier? Fancy suit, black car." The bartender raised an eyebrow. "You ask a lot of questions for someone I just met." David slid a $20 bill across the counter. The bartender smirked, pocketing it quickly. "Suit guy? Yeah, he's been in a few times. Doesn't say much, but whenever he shows up, he's always meeting someone new. Like your buddy back there. Did he leave anything? A note, a drink tab, anything?" The bartender shook his head. "Nothing like that, but he's careful. Always pays cash, never sticks around long." David's mind raced. This well-dressed man was careful, deliberate, traits of someone who knew how to cover their tracks. As David turned to leave the bar, Jake's text came through, "He's packing up. Looks like he's leaving." David spun around to see the man stuffing the envelope into his jacket and heading for the door. "Stay here," David said to Jake, already moving toward the exit. Outside, the man walked briskly down the street, his posture tense. David followed at a safe distance, careful to stay in the shadows. After several blocks, the man stopped abruptly and turned, his eyes scanning the empty street. David ducked behind a parked car, holding his breath. When the man turned back and continued walking, David resumed his pursuit, keeping his steps light and his movements cautious. The chase led to a nondescript building with boarded-up windows. The man slipped inside, and David hesitated, debating whether to follow. Suddenly, a hand gripped his arm, startling him. He spun around to find Jake, his face a mix of concern and determination. "You can't just walk in there," Jake whispered. "What if it's a trap?" David frowned. "We don't have a choice. He might be meeting someone, or there could be evidence inside." Jake sighed, nodding reluctantly. "Fine, but I'm coming with you." Together, they approached the building's entrance. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as they pushed it open. Inside, the space was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and mildew. Faint voices echoed from a room down the hall, drawing them deeper into the building. As they approached the source of the voices, David peeked around the corner. The man was speaking to someone, his tone urgent but too quiet to make out the words. The second figure was tall and commanding, though their face was obscured by the shadows. David leaned closer, straining to hear. "We need to move faster," the tall figure said, their voice low and authoritative. "He's on to us." David's stomach churned. Were they talking about him? What about the wife? The first man asked. David froze. His worst fear was now a chilling reality. She's playing her part, the tall figure replied. He doesn't suspect her yet, but if he does, we'll deal with it. David's heart pounded in his chest as the pieces began falling into place. Lila wasn't just involved. She was part of the plan. Jake tugged at David's sleeve, pulling him back toward the entrance. We need to go, he whispered. David nodded, his mind spinning with betrayal and rage. As they slipped out into the night, David knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about sabotage. It was personal. The drive back home was suffocating. David gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his mind consumed by the words he'd overheard. She's playing her part. He doesn't suspect her yet. Lila, the woman he'd trusted with his heart, his future, and every intimate part of his life. Could she really be involved in a plot against him? And why? Jake, sitting in the passenger seat, finally broke the silence. You okay, man? David let out a bitter laugh. No, not even close. Jake hesitated before speaking. Look, I know how it sounds, but are you sure they meant her? Maybe they're setting you up to think it's her. David's jaw tightened. I want to believe that, but everything's pointing back to her. The strange messages, her sudden secrecy, and now this. Jake nodded grimly. What's your next move? David didn't answer right away. His chest felt heavy as he realized what had to happen. I need proof. If Lila's involved, I have to know for sure. And if she's not, I need to clear her name. David dropped Jake off and drove home, his stomach churning. The house was dark when he arrived, save for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. Lila was curled up on the couch, a book in her hands. You're home late, she said, looking up with a smile. David forced himself to smile back. Got caught up with Jake. You know how he can be. She laughed softly. I do. As she closed her book and stood to greet him, David noticed something he hadn't before. A faint uneasiness in her eyes, as if she were carefully measuring her every move. Want some tea before bed? She asked, heading toward the kitchen. Sure, David said, following her. He watched as she prepared the tea, her actions smooth and practiced. For a moment, he thought he might be imagining things. But then her phone, sitting on the counter, lit up with a notification. David's heart skipped a beat. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, M. Graham. But the preview text was chilling. He's getting too close. Handle it. Who's M. Graham? David asked, his voice deceptively casual. Lila froze, her back to him, before quickly recovering. Oh, just someone from work. I'll check it later. David's suspicion deepened. Late for a work message, isn't it? She shrugged, her smile tight. It happens. The kettle whistled, breaking the tense silence. Lila poured the tea and handed him a cup, her expression neutral. David took a sip, his mind racing. He needed access to her phone, but he couldn't afford to make her suspicious. That night, as Lila slept soundly beside him, David lay awake, formulating a plan. Her phone was on the nightstand, within arm's reach. If he could get past her passcode, he might find the answers he desperately needed. Carefully, he reached for the device. His fingers brushed the edge, but Lila stirred, mumbling in her sleep. David froze, his heart pounding. When her breathing steadied again, he tried once more, this time successfully grabbing the phone. The lock screen glowed in the darkness, and David cursed under his breath. He didn't know the passcode. Then he remembered something. A few months ago, Lila had complained about her phone locking her out, and he'd suggested using an easy-to-remember number. Their anniversary. He punched in the date, and the screen unlocked. Relief flooded him, quickly replaced by dread as he began scrolling through her messages. The recent ones were innocuous, conversations with friends, reminders for appointments, but then he found the thread with M. Graham. Each message was like a dagger to his chest. M. Graham. He's starting to ask questions. Lila, I'll handle it. He doesn't suspect me yet. M. Graham, good. Stick to the plan. David stared at the screen, his hands trembling. The woman he loved was conspiring against him, and worse, she was working with someone who wanted him out of the picture. possibly permanently. The next morning, David acted as though everything was normal. Lila kissed him goodbye before heading out for a yoga class, her smile warm and unsuspecting. As soon as she was gone, David called Jake. "She's in on it," David said, his voice shaking. "I found the messages." Jake swore under his breath. "What now?" "I need to know who this Graham is," David replied. "And I need to know why they're after me." Jake hesitated. "That's dangerous, man. You're walking into some serious territory." David's eyes hardened. "I don't care. They tried to kill me, Jake. And if Lila's part of it, I need to stop her before she finishes the job." David spent the day digging into every scrap of information he could find. He scoured Lila's emails, her social media, and even her browsing history, piecing together a web of connections that led him closer to the truth. By the evening, he had a name: Martin Graham, a shadowy figure tied to high-stakes corporate sabotage and blackmail. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about personal betrayal. This was about power, money, and greed. And Lila was at the center of it all. David's resolve hardened. If Lila thought she could play him for a fool, she was wrong. It was time to turn the tables. David knew he couldn't confront Lila outright. Not yet. She was too clever, too good at deflecting suspicion. If he tipped his hand too soon, she might disappear, leaving him with no answers and no justice. Instead, he spent the day preparing his next move. He needed to gather concrete evidence, not just against Lila but also against Martin Graham. Step 1. Tracking Lila. David installed a GPS tracker on Lila's car while she was still at her yoga class. It was a desperate move, but desperation was all he had left. He needed to know where she was going and who she was meeting. Step 2. A warning to Jake. David called Jake to update him on the plan. "Be careful, man," Jake warned. "These people don't play around. If they find out you're onto them—" "They won't," David cut him off. "Not until I have enough to take them down." Jake hesitated. "And Lila? What are you gonna do if she's, really part of this?" David swallowed hard, the question cutting deeper than he expected. "I'll deal with it when the time comes." That evening, Lila returned home later than usual, claiming her yoga class had run over. David acted indifferent, but he knew better. The tracker showed her car had stopped in a secluded parking lot miles from her studio. As they ate dinner, David studied her, searching for cracks in her facade. She seemed perfectly at ease, laughing at his jokes and asking about his day. It was almost enough to make him doubt himself. Almost. The next morning, David left for work, but instead parked a few blocks from the house, waiting. Lila left shortly after, driving in the opposite direction of her usual errands. David tailed her from a safe distance, the GPS tracker feeding him updates. She drove to an upscale cafe in a quiet part of town. David parked across the street, his heart racing as he watched her enter. Minutes later, a man joined her at the table. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and exuded the kind of confidence that came with wealth and power. David didn't need an introduction to know who he was. David snapped photos from his car, capturing their interaction. The two spoke intensely, leaning in close. At one point, Lila slid a folder across the table, which Graham opened, nodding in approval. David's stomach churned. She wasn't just involved. She was actively working with him. That night, David reviewed the photos and messages he'd gathered. It was enough to prove Lila's involvement, but he needed more on Graham. If he could expose the full extent of their operation, he might have a chance to clear his name and take them down. David called Jake. "I need a favor," he said. "Can you help me dig up everything you can on Martin Graham? Contacts, finances, criminal records, anything." Jake sighed. "You're really going all in on this, huh?" "I don't have a choice," David replied. "If I don't stop him, he'll ruin me, or worse." By morning, Jake had come through with a trove of information. Graham was connected to multiple corporations, all with a history of underhanded deals and sudden bankruptcies. More disturbingly, Jake found rumors of Graham's involvement in several mysterious deaths, all tied to people who had crossed him. "You need to be careful," Jake said. "This guy's dangerous." David nodded grimly. "So am I." That evening, David decided to test Lila. As they sat on the couch, watching a movie, he casually mentioned a business deal he was considering, one that Graham would find interesting. "I've been thinking about expanding into new markets," David said. "There's this investor I've been talking to. He's interested in putting up serious money." Lila's smile faltered for the briefest moment. "Oh, what's his name?" David pretended not to notice her reaction. "Just someone I met through a friend. I'll tell you more if it works out." Lila nodded, her expression unreadable. "I hope it does. You deserve a win." Her words were kind, but her tone was hollow. David could almost see the wheels turning in her mind, calculating her next move. Over the next few days, David carefully leaked bits of false information, knowing Lila would pass them along to Graham. Each time, he watched her closely, noting how she reacted and when she disappeared for her mysterious meetings. The final piece of the trap came when David mentioned a supposed vulnerability in his company, a non-existent backdoor that would give someone access to confidential financial data. That night, he watched as Lila sent a message to Graham. "He's made a mistake. I'll get the details." David's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. The trap was set. Now, all he had to do was wait. In the darkness of their bedroom, David stared at the ceiling, his mind a storm of emotions. He still didn't know why Lila had betrayed him, but soon, he'd have his answers. And when he did, there would be no going back. David barely slept that night. The weight of betrayal pressed down on him, mingling with the resolve to see his plan through. Lila was slipping into her double life so seamlessly that, had he not known better, he might have believed her innocent. By morning, the false vulnerability David had planted, his company's supposed financial backdoor, was already in play. Lila had taken the bait, and he was sure it wouldn't be long before Graham moved on the information. David arranged a meeting with an old friend, Angela, who worked as a cybersecurity consultant. She was sharp, resourceful, and, most importantly, trusted to keep a secret. "You're sure this will lure him out?" Angela asked, scanning the fabricated data. "It has to," David said, leaning forward. "He can't resist an opportunity like this. Once he tries to access it, you'll trace it back to him, right?" Angela nodded. "If Graham's as arrogant as you say, he won't bother hiding his tracks. We'll catch him." David exhaled, relief mingling with the anxiety still coursing through him. "And Lila?" Angela asked gently. David's jaw tightened. "I'll deal with her after I have proof. She doesn't know I'm onto her, not fully." David spent the next day pretending everything was normal. Over breakfast, Lila asked casual questions about his work, subtly fishing for details. "So, this new project you're working on, it must be exciting," she said, sipping her coffee. David smiled. "It is. Stressful, though. Big risks, bigger rewards." Lila tilted her head, feigning interest. "Anything I can help with?" David shook his head. "No, but thanks. I've got it under control." Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. By afternoon, David received confirmation from Angela. Graham had taken the bait. A server located in one of his shell companies had attempted to access the fake backdoor. "We've got him," Angela said over the phone. "The trail's solid. You can go to the authorities with this." David hesitated. "Not yet. I need more, something irrefutable." Angela sighed. "Just be careful. These people don't play fair." That evening, David decided it was time to push Lila further. "Hey," he said as they sat on the couch. "I was thinking about taking a quick trip this weekend. Get out of the city, clear my head." Lila's brow furrowed slightly. "That's sudden. Work getting to you?" David nodded. "Yeah, figured it might help me focus." Her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Where were you thinking of going?" "Not sure yet. Somewhere quiet. Maybe the cabin upstate." Lila's lips curved into a small, unreadable smile. "Sounds like a good idea. You'll let me know if you need anything?" "Of course," David said, his stomach nodding. Her reaction confirmed his fears. She wasn't worried about him leaving. She was calculating how to use it to her advantage. The next morning, David left for his supposed trip, his car packed with just enough belongings to sell the story. Instead of heading to the cabin, he parked in a motel lot on the outskirts of town, his laptop open on the passenger seat. Angela's voice crackled through his phone. You were right. Graham's moving faster than expected. He's calling in reinforcements. What kind of reinforcements? David asked, his pulse quickening. Looks like he's trying to erase his trail, emails, bank records, everything. If you're going to act, it has to be now. David gritted his teeth. What about Lila? Angela hesitated. She hasn't made any moves yet, but be prepared. If she's as deep in this as you think, she might try something desperate. David stared at the motel ceiling, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. Lila wasn't just a pawn. She was a willing participant in whatever game Graham was playing, and she might already know that David was a step ahead. That evening, David returned home, his nerves frayed. He parked a few blocks away and approached the house on foot, careful to stay out of sight. Inside, the lights were on, and Lila's silhouette moved through the living room. She was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear. David crept closer, straining to hear. I told you, he's out of town. I'll handle it. No, he doesn't suspect anything. David clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. He slipped around to the back of the house and let himself in through the kitchen, careful to avoid making noise. As he approached the living room, he caught the tail end of her conversation. Okay, I'll meet you tomorrow. We'll finish this. She hung up and turned, nearly jumping out of her skin when she saw David standing in the doorway. You're home early, she said, her voice tight. David forced a smile. Decided I'd rather be here. Lila's eyes flicked to her phone, and David saw the panic she was trying to hide. Everything okay? He asked, stepping closer. Of course, she said quickly. Just work stuff. David nodded slowly, the tension between them thick enough to cut. I'm glad you're here, Lila said after a beat, her tone softening. We should talk. David's stomach dropped. About what? She hesitated, then smiled. Us. David met her gaze, searching for the woman he'd once loved. But all he saw now was a stranger. Sure, he said, his voice steady. Let's talk. Inside, his resolve hardened. The time for waiting was over. Tomorrow, he'd end this, one way or another. The night dragged on like a taut string, vibrating with unspoken tension. David could feel the clock ticking, the pressure mounting. He couldn't afford to let his guard down for a second. Not when everything was on the line. Lila's smile was polite but strained, her eyes darting around the room as if trying to find an escape. David remained calm, studying her every movement. He knew better than to trust anything she said now. So, what is it we need to talk about? David asked, his voice smooth, betraying none of the anxiety coiling inside him. Lila's fingers gripped the edge of the couch, her nails digging into the fabric as if she were holding herself together. About us, David, she said slowly, her voice soft and almost affectionate. About everything that's happened. I think it's time we figured out where we're really at. David fought to suppress a laugh, bitter and sharp. You're right, he said quietly. We need to figure this out. Lila's expression shifted ever so slightly, as though she hadn't expected him to agree so easily. She leaned forward, eyes glinting with a mix of frustration and calculated calm. I know you've been suspicious, David, but I swear, I never meant for any of this to happen. I did what I had to do. David held her gaze, letting the words sink in. What exactly are you talking about, Lila? She swallowed hard, then exhaled sharply. I didn't want it to go this far. I didn't want to hurt you. Her voice trembled, and for a fleeting moment, David saw the woman he thought he knew. But then it vanished, replaced by a cold determination. I had no choice. It was either him or us. David stepped closer, his heart pounding. So, Martin Graham? Lila nodded, her lips tight. Yes, he promised me everything. Money, power, freedom. All I had to do was help him. David's mind raced. Everything he had suspected was true, but there was something more, something deeper. He needed her to say it. He needed her to make it real. Help him with what, Lila? He pressed, his voice low but steady. She hesitated. For a brief moment, she looked like she might crumble. But then, as though steeling herself for the inevitable, she spoke. He was going to make you disappear, David. I didn't have a choice. It was too late by the time I realized what was really going on. David felt the ground shift beneath him. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Disappear? How far had Lila really gone to protect herself and him? Was she so far gone that she would have let him die? You were going to let him kill me? David's voice was barely above a whisper, though the words felt like they were tearing him apart. Lila looked away. I didn't want that to happen. But he's not someone you just walk away from, David. You can't. I tried to warn you. David's pulse quickened, his fists clenching at his sides. Warn me? You were the one setting me up from the beginning. Stop. Lila shot to her feet, her face flushed with emotion. You don't understand. I did it for us. For the future. I didn't want you to be involved, but there was no other way. David was torn between anger and disbelief. The woman he had loved, the one he had trusted with his life, was now a stranger, caught in a web of lies and deceit. Then why didn't you just tell me? Why keep playing this game? He demanded. Lila closed her eyes, tears brimming in her lashes. Because I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't understand. Afraid you'd leave me. David's stomach churned. The depth of her manipulation was worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just about money or survival. It was about control. She had wanted to keep him in the dark, to trap him in her version of reality. A long silence stretched between them. David's mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had been laid bare in the last few minutes. He needed to make a decision. He couldn't afford to be indecisive any longer. Where is Martin now? David finally asked, his voice cold. Lila flinched. I don't know. He told me to meet him tomorrow, to finalize everything. He doesn't trust you anymore. She looked up at him, pleading. David, please. It's not too late to walk away from this. We can still go. No, David's voice was firm. I'm done walking away. David had no intention of letting Lila get away with this. Not now that the full truth was out. He couldn't just confront her and let her walk away again. He had one more card to play. Angela had set the trap, but it was David who needed to pull the trigger. I'm going to take down Graham, David said, his voice unwavering. And you, Lila, are going to help me. Lila shook her head. You don't know what you're asking, David. He won't just let you go. It'll be worse for both of us. David walked over to her, stopping just inches from her. You've made your choices. Now I'm making mine. You want redemption? Then help me take him down. Or you can walk away and live with the consequences of your actions. Lila's expression shifted, her defenses cracking. She seemed to realize the weight of what was at stake, and the regret in her eyes was unmistakable. Okay, she said softly. Okay, I'll help. But you have to promise me, David. You have to promise me you'll be careful. Graham won't go down without a fight. David nodded grimly. I know, but I'm not backing down. Not now. The final confrontation was set. The trap was laid. And tomorrow, they would either destroy Martin Graham and his empire, or become the next victims in his ruthless game. David could only hope that, in the end, he would come out on top. But he was ready to face whatever came next. The air felt thick with tension as David stood in the dimly lit motel room, his mind racing with the possibilities of what would happen next. He had no more room for second-guessing. Everything had led to this moment. He had just one choice: to take down Martin Graham and make Lila face the consequences of her betrayal, or walk away and let everything fall apart. Lila had agreed to help, but David didn't know if he could trust her completely. She had deceived him for too long, and the uncertainty in her eyes told him she was still playing a game of her own. Yet, deep down, David knew there was a part of her, perhaps the woman he had once loved, that still wanted to redeem herself. The next morning, David and Lila set out for the warehouse where they were supposed to meet Graham. The location was isolated, a place hidden in the outskirts of the city, far from prying eyes. David knew it was the perfect spot for a final confrontation, but it was also a place where anything could go wrong. You sure you're ready for this? Lila asked as they drove through the quiet streets, her voice tinged with nervousness. David glanced at her. I don't have a choice anymore. Lila nodded, but didn't say anything else. There was no point in trying to soften the reality they both faced. When they arrived at the warehouse, the air was thick with silence. The building loomed before them, its windows boarded up, its entry doors unwelcoming. A single car was parked outside, Martin Graham's. David parked his car a little farther down the street, trying to stay out of sight. He checked his phone, confirming that Angela had set up the final surveillance feeds. If anything went wrong, they'd have evidence to use against Graham and his associates. "I'll stay outside and keep watch," David told Lila as they approached the entrance. "You go in and talk to him. If everything goes well, we're done here." Lila hesitated for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, but you have to promise me something." David raised an eyebrow. "What?" "That you'll be careful. Please, David. You don't know how dangerous he is." "I'll be careful," David said, although the weight of his words felt heavy. He didn't want to promise something he wasn't sure he could control. Lila walked into the warehouse, her heels clicking against the cold concrete floor. The space inside was cavernous, echoing with every step. She could feel the chill in the air, and it wasn't just from the temperature. Martin Graham's presence was overwhelming. She found him standing by a stack of crates, his back turned to her. He didn't even acknowledge her entrance. "You came," he said without turning around, his voice smooth, almost predatory. Lila's stomach tightened, but she held her ground. "I told you I would." Finally, Graham turned to face her, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took her in. "You've done well, Lila. I knew I could count on you." Lila bit back a bitter laugh. "I didn't do it for you." Graham's smile was thin. "No, you did it for yourself." He paused, studying her for a moment. "I'm curious, though. Why would you turn on him now? You've been playing this game for a while." Lila swallowed hard. She could feel David's presence just outside, the stakes higher than ever. But this was it. She had to do this, or all would be lost. "I'm done playing your game, Graham," Lila said firmly. "I want out." A flash of surprise flickered in Graham's eyes before he quickly masked it with cold indifference. "You think you can just walk away? You think I'll let you go after everything you've done for me?" Lila met his gaze, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "I didn't know what I was getting into. I was just trying to protect the people I love." Graham took a step forward, his presence towering over her. "You're a fool if you think I'm going to let you go. You're mine now, Lila. And so is David." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She had known Graham was ruthless, but this was more than she had bargained for. She could feel the walls closing in around her. "I'm not yours," Lila said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "And neither is David." Outside, David was watching everything unfold through his phone, connected to Angela's live feed. He had set up cameras in the warehouse, hoping to catch Graham's every move. But as the minutes ticked by, he grew restless. Something wasn't right. The silence inside was too deep, too heavy. It was almost as if they were waiting for something, or someone, to make a move. Without thinking, David moved toward the warehouse, making sure to stay hidden. He wasn't about to let Lila face Graham alone. Inside, the conversation between Lila and Graham was escalating. David could hear the tension in their voices, the air charged with the weight of impending disaster. He reached for his phone to call Angela for backup when, suddenly, the warehouse doors slammed open, and a group of armed men stepped inside. Lila's heart stopped as she turned to see Graham's men blocking the entrance. She had underestimated him. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. "David," she called out, her voice shaking. David's heart raced. He could hear Lila's voice now, but it was too late to back out. He burst through the door, stepping into the dimly lit room. He saw Lila standing frozen, Graham smiling smugly, and the men surrounding them. "You're too late," Graham said, his voice a low growl. "I knew you'd come, but now you're in my territory." David stood tall, his jaw clenched in defiance. "Not anymore, Graham." Suddenly, a loud, sharp noise echoed through the space, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Everything went silent. David's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted around the room, trying to locate the source of the shot. Was Lila? But before he could make another move, the door behind him slammed shut, and the lights went out. The warehouse was plunged into darkness. The world plunged into darkness, the air thick with tension and the echoes of gunfire still ringing in David's ears. His heart raced as he instinctively reached for his phone, only to realize it was no longer in his hand. Panic began to set in. What had just happened? Who had been shot? Lila, David called, his voice hoarse in the heavy silence. He strained to hear any sound, but there was nothing, no movement, no response. Suddenly, the flickering lights came back on, casting an eerie glow over the scene. David's eyes quickly adjusted, his senses on high alert. He scanned the warehouse, searching for any sign of life. Lila stood against the far wall, her hands pressed against her face, trembling. Her eyes were wide with fear. Graham's men had scattered into the shadows, their forms barely visible. "David, behind you!" Lila screamed. David whirled just in time to see one of Graham's men charging at him with a crowbar raised high. With a quick, instinctive move, David dodged, grabbing a metal pipe from the floor. He swung it with all his might, knocking the attacker back. But there were more of them. The warehouse was no longer just a battleground. It had become a trap. David was outnumbered, and he could feel the cold edge of desperation cutting through his chest. "Angela!" he shouted, knowing she would be monitoring the situation. But there was no response. Was the signal cut off? The next few seconds felt like an eternity as David fought back, using the pipe to deflect blows and push attackers away. He caught a glimpse of Lila, still frozen against the wall, but she wasn't safe. Graham's men were closing in. Lila's heart was pounding as she watched David fight for his life. She had been part of the plan. Her betrayal had led to this moment. But now, seeing the man she had once loved, struggling to stay alive, something inside her broke. She had to do something. She couldn't let him die because of her mistakes. Summoning every ounce of courage, Lila pushed herself off the wall and ran toward the nearest pile of crates. She searched frantically, finally finding what she was looking for. A small, concealed handgun tucked into one of the crates. She had no idea how long it had been there or who had placed it, but now wasn't the time to question it. The sound of a struggle intensified, and Lila knew it was now or never. She took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and rushed toward the closest attacker. "David!" she yelled, her voice trembling. David turned just as Lila fired the gun, the bullet striking the man in the shoulder. He dropped to the ground with a loud thud, the crowbar slipping from his grip. "Get down!" David shouted, ducking behind a stack of crates. Lila fired again, hitting another one of Graham's men in the leg. The chaos was overwhelming. David, despite the close call, quickly sprang to action, grabbing the fallen crowbar and using it to disarm the others. "Are you insane?" he snapped as Lila moved to his side. "I'm trying to help you, David," she replied, her voice sharp with urgency. As the last of Graham's men collapsed to the floor, David and Lila finally found themselves facing Martin Graham. He was standing near a set of locked doors, his face twisted in cold amusement. "So, this is how it ends," Graham said, his voice low and mocking. "I always knew it would come to this. You were never supposed to make it out alive, David." David stepped forward, his voice firm. "I'm done with you, Graham. This is over." Graham smirked, glancing at the door behind him. "You really think it's over? You have no idea what you're up against. You think you've won, but the game has just begun." David's blood ran cold. He could see the madness in Graham's eyes. He wasn't just a man trying to survive. He was someone who thrived on control, on manipulation, and on fear. Lila took a step toward David, her hands still shaking as she held the gun. "He's right. There's more to this than just us, David. There are bigger forces at play." David's mind raced. What was she saying? Was she trying to warn him, or was she justifying her past actions? Suddenly, the sound of sirens cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Graham's smile faltered. He wasn't expecting this. "Cops," he sneered. "You think they'll save you?" David's eyes narrowed. "No, but they'll make sure you never get away with this." In that moment, Graham's composure shattered. He turned, quickly moving toward the back of the warehouse, but David wasn't about to let him escape. "Not so fast," David said, stepping forward and pointing the crowbar at Graham. Graham froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had underestimated David and Lila one last time. The police arrived just as Graham was trying to reach the exit. Officers flooded the warehouse, guns drawn, but David and Lila stood their ground. Graham's plans had failed. He was cornered. As the officers closed in on him, Graham let out a frustrated roar. "You think this is over? You think you've won? You've only scratched the surface. I'll get out. I'll destroy you all." David shook his head. "You're done, Graham." Lila stood beside him, her hands still trembling as she watched the police cuff Graham. "It's over," she said softly. "Finally." David didn't respond at first. He couldn't. There was too much to process, too many questions about Lila, about the choices they had made, and about what had been lost in the process. But one thing was clear. They had both survived. And that, for now, had to be enough. Weeks passed before David and Lila were able to truly begin to process everything that had happened. Graham was behind bars, awaiting trial, but the road ahead was far from easy. David had to come to terms with Lila's betrayal, with the choices she had made, and with the scars left on both of them. But in the quiet moments, when they didn't speak, they both understood that they had fought for something more than just survival. And that, at least for now, was the most they could ask for. David stared out the window, his thoughts heavy but resolute. There was still much to rebuild, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The aftermath of the showdown with Graham was only the beginning of a much longer journey. For David and Lila, the weeks that followed were a blur of media attention, legal proceedings, and the haunting echo of past choices. Yet, amidst it all, there was something unspoken between them. A chance to rebuild, if only they were willing to face the consequences. David found himself sitting alone in his small apartment one night, staring out at the city lights. It was quiet now, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the warehouse. The police reports had been filed, Graham was in custody, and yet, David felt a weight that no legal victory could lift. Lila had been quieter than usual. She had taken up a job at a local cafe, trying to find some semblance of normalcy after everything. David hadn't expected things to go back to what they once were, but he did wonder if there was any possibility of repairing what had been broken between them. One evening, after a long shift at the cafe, Lila walked into the apartment where David was sitting, looking weary but determined. She stood by the door for a moment before speaking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, David," she started, her voice soft but steady. "I hurt you. I betrayed you, and I can't take that back. But I want you to know, I'm sorry. I've never meant for things to get this far." David didn't turn to face her at first. He had heard those words before, had heard apologies that meant nothing, but there was something different in Lila's voice now. She wasn't asking for a second chance. She was asking for something more meaningful, understanding. "I know you didn't mean for it to go this way," David said after a long pause, his voice thick with the weight of his emotions. "But you still made choices that led us here. We're both dealing with the fallout of those choices." Lila nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, even if it's just showing you that I've changed." David finally turned to face her. There was a deep pain in his eyes, but also something else, something that hadn't been there before. Perhaps it was the beginning of acceptance. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted quietly, "but I can't pretend like everything's okay. I need time to figure out what that means." Lila's shoulders sagged with the weight of his words, but she didn't flinch. She understood. "I'm here, David. Whatever you need. I'm not going anywhere." In the weeks that followed, David and Lila continued their separate paths. David threw himself into rebuilding his life. He started working with Angela and the legal team to ensure that Graham's associates wouldn't slip through the cracks. Despite the closure of the case, the far-reaching influence of Graham's criminal network loomed large, and David knew they couldn't stop at just one victory. Lila, for her part, took things slowly. The guilt she carried was heavy, but it didn't outweigh her determination to atone. She enrolled in a community outreach program, helping others who had been affected by the same kind of betrayal she had inflicted on David. It wasn't a path to redemption. It was a step toward healing, for both of them. There were moments of tension between them, when old wounds reopened or when silence became a suffocating presence in the room. But there were also moments of connection, brief but meaningful, where David saw glimpses of the woman she used to be, before the lies and the manipulation. He wasn't sure if they would ever be able to rebuild what they once had, but for the first time, he was willing to try. One evening, as David sat on his balcony overlooking the city, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was from an unknown number. "David, it's Angela. We need to talk. It's about Lila." David's heart sank. He stood up quickly, his mind racing. What could Angela possibly know? His first instinct was to call her, but he paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The situation was already fragile, and the last thing he wanted was to make it worse. He dialed Angela's number. "David," Angela's voice came through the line, tight with urgency. "I've been digging into Graham's old associates. There's something you need to know, something you won't believe." "What is it, Angela?" "There's a reason Lila was involved in this. It's not what you think. I know you're trying to move on, but you can't ignore this. You need to know the truth about her connection to Graham." David felt a chill run down his spine. He had already been through so much, but now it seemed like there was more to uncover, more lies that had yet to surface. "Meet me tomorrow morning at the office," Angela continued. "I'll show you everything." David hung up the phone, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. Just when he thought he had a handle on things, the past was ready to pull him back in. He knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be simple again. The next day, David met Angela at the office, his mind clouded with uncertainty. She led him to a back room, where she had laid out several files and documents. As he sat down, Angela handed him a folder. "David, this isn't just about Graham. It's about something bigger, something Lila hasn't told you. She's been hiding something, and I think it's time you knew." David hesitated, but the urge to know the truth overpowered his doubt. He flipped open the folder, scanning through the pages. As he read, his stomach twisted in disbelief. Lila hadn't just been an unwilling accomplice. She had been involved in something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. David's hands trembled as the pieces began to fall into place. Lila's ties to Graham were not just personal. They were financial, strategic, and deeply embedded in his criminal empire. She had played a role far larger than anyone had realized, and her betrayal had been far more calculated than David could have imagined. But the most shocking part of all, Lila's involvement with Graham had never been about love or loyalty. It had been about survival. She had been trapped in a web of debts and threats, and the very man who she had betrayed David for had been the one who had coerced her into it. David leaned back in the chair, his mind reeling. This was a truth that no one had expected, and it was one that would change everything. But as he looked down at the papers in his hands, one thing was clear. There was no going back. The truth had a way of unraveling everything. David stared at the documents for what felt like an eternity. His thoughts collided. His loyalty to Lila, the pain of her betrayal, the weight of everything he had lost. What was the right thing to do now? What did the truth mean for them both? In that moment, David realized something. The truth wasn't always about clarity or justice. Sometimes it was about understanding and choosing whether or not you could still love someone, even when the truth shattered everything you thought you knew. But that, too, was a choice he would have to make. David sat in the small, dimly lit office, the weight of the files still heavy in his hands. His mind was spinning. The truth about Lila's involvement with Graham had shattered his already fragile understanding of their relationship. What had seemed like a betrayal of love now felt like a betrayal of everything: trust, loyalty, and the very foundation of the future he thought they might have built together. Angela was sitting across from him, watching him closely. She didn't say anything at first, giving him the space he needed to process what he had just read. Her eyes, though, were full of understanding. She knew the turmoil David was experiencing. She had seen it all before. Loved ones torn apart by the brutal honesty of the past. "What are you going to do, David?" Angela finally asked, her voice low. David took a long, shaky breath. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. Later that evening, David went back to the apartment. The weight of the revelation hung over him, casting a shadow over everything. He walked in to find Lila sitting on the couch, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up when he entered, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of apprehension and hope. "David," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I've been waiting for you." David didn't sit down. Instead, he stood in front of her, holding the folder in his hands. Lila's eyes immediately flickered to the folder, her face paling. "You knew, didn't you?" David's voice was tight with the weight of his emotions. "You knew all along. Everything I've been through, everything we've been through, it was all part of your plan, wasn't it?" Lila stood quickly, her hands outstretched as if to reach him. "David, please, listen to me." But David couldn't. "Not yet. Tell me the truth, Lila," he demanded, his voice rising. "Tell me why you did it. Tell me why you let me believe you were on my side." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but she didn't look away. "I never wanted to hurt you. I swear, David. But you don't know what it was like. You don't understand the kind of pressure I was under." David's chest tightened. "Pressure? From Graham? You were working for him all along, weren't you?" Lila nodded, but her voice was shaky. "I wasn't working for him by choice, David. I didn't have a choice. He had leverage over me, over my family, over everything I cared about. I tried to get out, I tried to stop, but every time I made a move, he pulled me right back in. It wasn't until you were in danger, and I realized I couldn't let him control me anymore. But by then, it was too late. I had already lost your trust." David's heart twisted as he listened to her, the rawness of her words settling deep within him. He had been so sure, so certain that Lila had chosen betrayal for reasons he could never understand. But now, as she stood there, tears streaking down her face, he saw something different: guilt, regret, and above all, fear. Fear of the man who had controlled her, manipulated her, and dragged her into a world she had never wanted. David's mind raced. Everything Lila had said made sense, but it didn't change the fact that she had lied to him, deceived him, and put him in harm's way. She had made decisions that had nearly cost him everything. The truth was, David wasn't sure he could ever forgive her. But there was something inside him that couldn't let go of the woman he had once known. The woman who had laughed with him, shared dreams with him, and held his hand when things seemed impossible. Was that person still in there? Could she still be saved? "You have to understand, Lila," David said quietly, his voice low and steady. "I don't know how to look at you the same way anymore. You've changed, and so have I. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Lila's face crumpled with the weight of his words. She took a step back, wiping away a tear. "I know, David. I understand if you can't. I don't expect you to. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I never stopped caring for you. Even when I made the worst choices of my life, I always knew I was wrong. But I was trapped. I didn't see a way out until it was too late," David finished for her, his voice bitter. "Until I was involved, and you realized you couldn't risk losing me, too." Lila nodded, her face etched with sorrow. "Yes, I couldn't risk losing you, David. But I also couldn't keep pretending like everything was okay when it wasn't. I was already drowning, and I dragged you under with me." David closed his eyes, his mind heavy with the weight of it all. He had always believed in the power of redemption and second chances. But could he extend that grace to someone who had hurt him so deeply? David took a long breath, the room heavy with silence. He had spent so many years blaming Lila for the pain, for the lies, for the betrayal. But now, seeing her stand before him, broken and vulnerable, he felt something shift inside him. The anger, the bitterness. It was still there, but so was something else. A recognition that people could change, that they could grow, and that love could still heal, even the deepest wounds. "Lila," David said, his voice softening, "I don't know what happens next. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were. But I'm not going to turn my back on you. Not yet. You've got to prove that you're not the person you were. And that's going to take time." Lila's eyes widened, and she stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached for him. "David, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes. I will make it right. I'll prove it to you. I promise." David didn't know if he believed her yet, but he was willing to give her the chance to prove it. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe there was still a way forward. Maybe they could find a new path together. But it wasn't going to be easy, and the scars of their past would never fully heal. However, in that moment, David realized that perhaps the hardest part wasn't forgiveness. It was learning to trust again, and that too would take time. As the night stretched on, David and Lila stood together in the quiet apartment, uncertain of what the future would hold. But for the first time, they were both willing to face it, not as the people they used to be, but as the people they had become. A slow, fragile hope began to take root between them. It wasn't a guarantee of happiness, but it was a step forward. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. The weeks that followed were neither simple nor easy for David and Lila. Rebuilding their relationship, if that was even possible, would take time, patience, and more effort than either of them could have imagined. But as they both found, there was a strange peace in trying, in moving forward step by step, even when the past loomed large between them. David continued with his work, his focus sharper than ever as he dealt with the aftermath of Graham's criminal empire. The pressure didn't let up, but there was a sense of purpose now that had been lacking before. It was a busy, often isolating time, but it kept his mind occupied, away from the growing complexities of his relationship with Lila. Lila, on the other hand, continued to work at the cafe, but something had shifted in her. She was no longer the woman who had hidden behind lies and fear. She had started taking on more responsibilities, stepping up to help in the community, and becoming more involved with the people who had once been strangers to her. She was determined to make up for the mistakes she had made, not just for David's sake, but for her own as well. She wanted to prove that she could be better, not just for him, but for herself. One evening, about a month after their difficult conversation, David sat down on the couch in their apartment, a cup of coffee in his hands, staring at the window as the city lights twinkled in the distance. The quiet in the apartment had become somewhat comforting over time, and yet it felt like something was missing. Lila entered from the kitchen, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a soft smile. She placed a small dish of freshly baked cookies on the coffee table, sitting down beside David. "Made your favorite," she said quietly, her voice tentative but hopeful. David glanced at the cookies, then at her. He had to admit, despite everything that had happened, there were moments, small moments, when the old warmth between them flickered back to life. He hadn't been able to forget, not entirely, but for the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about the betrayal or the lies. Instead, he thought about the woman sitting beside him. "Thank you," he replied simply, picking up a cookie and taking a bite. The sweet, familiar taste made him smile despite himself. "These are really good, Lila." She smiled back, relief crossing her face. "I'm glad you like them." They sat in silence for a few moments, the kind of silence that had become comfortable between them in recent days. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for now, that was enough. The tension between them wasn't gone, and neither of them had completely let go of the weight of the past. But they had started to find ways to connect, small conversations that weren't overshadowed by accusations or old wounds. They shared moments of quiet, moments of understanding, and moments of raw honesty. But there were also difficult moments when the old pain would resurface. One night, as they sat together watching a movie, the phone rang. David glanced at it, the caller ID displaying Angela's name. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "David," Angela's voice came through the line, clipped and urgent. "I need to talk to you. It's about the case." David sat up straighter, his instincts kicking in. "What's going on?" "I've got news. Something new has come up. We need to meet as soon as possible." David glanced at Lila, who had paused the movie, her eyes on him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I'll be there in an hour," he said, already grabbing his jacket. He turned back to Lila, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'll be right back. Stay here. We'll talk more later." Lila nodded, though there was a hint of worry in her eyes. David left, and Lila sat in the quiet apartment, her thoughts swirling. For all the progress they had made, she knew that David's world wasn't finished with Graham yet, and she wasn't sure if her presence in it would make things better or worse. David met Angela in her office, the room dimly lit and filled with files and paperwork. He sat down across from her, his mind already racing with possibilities. "What's going on, Angela?" he asked. Angela leaned forward, her eyes dark with concern. "It's about the remnants of Graham's organization. We thought we had cleared everything up, but there's more. There's someone in the city, someone close to us, who's been working in the shadows. I've been tracking a few of the accounts linked to Graham, and they're still active." David frowned. "Who's been behind it?" Angela hesitated before answering. "Lila." David's heart dropped. "What do you mean?" "She's been receiving money, transfers from an unknown account, linked directly to Graham's old associates. I've been tracking it for weeks, and there's no mistake." David's mind reeled. He couldn't have heard her right. "Are you saying Lila has been involved with them again?" Angela nodded slowly, her expression serious. "I don't know if she's still working with them, but she's been getting payments. We need to know why. You need to talk to her." David returned home later that night, his thoughts heavy. He couldn't process what Angela had told him. Was it possible that Lila had been hiding something else? Or was it all some sort of misunderstanding? When he walked through the door, he found Lila sitting on the couch, waiting for him. She looked up at him, and there was a nervousness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "David," she said quietly, standing up, "you're back late. What happened?" David didn't immediately answer. He couldn't. His emotions were too raw, too confused. He had to know the truth. "I need you to tell me, Lila," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Are you still involved with them? With Graham's people? Why have you been getting payments from his accounts?" Lila froze, her face draining of color. Her eyes went wide, and she took a step back. "David, Don't lie to me," David interrupted, his voice sharp. "Please, just tell me the truth. I need to know." Lila's face crumpled, and for the first time, David saw a kind of fear in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "David, I didn't want to hurt you. I swear, I didn't. But I didn't have a choice." David's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" Lila swallowed hard. "I was trying to cut ties with them, trying to get out. But they've been watching me. They know I'm trying to leave, and if I don't keep doing what they ask, they'll hurt me, they'll hurt us. I had no other way to protect us, David." David stood in stunned silence. The betrayal felt like it was happening all over again. But this time it wasn't just about Lila. It was about the world she had been forced to navigate, the fear she had been living with, the lies she had been telling to survive. David took a long, shuddering breath. He didn't know what to do. Could he forgive her again? Could he trust her to tell him the truth now? But as he looked at Lila, standing before him, broken and vulnerable, he realized something. Maybe trust wasn't something that could be fixed in one conversation, in one moment. Maybe it was something they would have to build together, one piece at a time. And that, David realized, was the hardest part of all. The following days were filled with tension and uncertainty. The truth had been laid bare, and both David and Lila were standing on the precipice of a future neither of them fully understood. The emotions that churned inside them were complex: guilt, anger, confusion, and, for David, a deep sense of betrayal that he wasn't sure he could shake off. Yet, there was something else there too, a glimmer of hope, however faint, that perhaps things could change. David had to make a choice. He couldn't keep living in the shadows of the past, but he couldn't ignore the danger that lingered, the shadow of Graham's criminal empire still hovering over their lives. The payments, the threats. Lila had been caught in a vicious cycle, one that would require more than just love and forgiveness to break. One evening, as David was finishing a late report for work, he found himself staring out the window, his mind still tangled with everything he had learned. Lila had tried to explain herself, but it was hard to believe her completely. The past kept haunting him. Every lie, every secret, every time she had said she was done with Graham, only for another piece of evidence to emerge proving she wasn't. It felt like a constant unraveling. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a text from Angela. "David, I need you to meet me. This is urgent." David stared at the message for a moment before replying, his heart racing. He couldn't keep avoiding the situation. He needed answers. Answers that would finally tell him if Lila was still hiding something from him. Angela's office was quiet, the overhead lights casting a soft glow over the piles of paperwork scattered across the desk. She was sitting, looking over a report, when David walked in, her eyes lifting to meet his. "David," Angela said, her voice serious. "This is worse than we thought." David took a seat, his mind already racing. "What now?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "What's the next piece of the puzzle?" Angela slid a folder across the desk. "We traced the money back further than we thought. There's someone else involved, a powerful figure within Graham's organization. We've been tracking them for weeks now, and we think they're targeting Lila." David's heart skipped a beat. Targeting her? His voice was low, filled with disbelief. "What do you mean?" Angela looked him directly in the eye. "They're using her, threatening her. And if she doesn't comply with their demands, they'll kill her, David. They've already made it clear. She's still tied to them, whether she likes it or not." David sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. "I knew it," he muttered. "I knew there was something she wasn't telling me." Angela's expression softened. "It's not that simple. They've kept her in a constant state of fear, David. She's been living under their thumb this whole time. She's trying to escape, but it's not going to be easy. It's going to take more than just her turning over a new leaf." David felt a knot form in his stomach. The realization that Lila had been living with this constant danger was a gut punch. He had been so focused on his own pain, his own sense of betrayal, that he hadn't fully understood the weight of what she had been enduring. She hadn't been lying to him just to protect herself. She had been lying to protect him too. That night, David returned home, his mind swirling. Lila was waiting for him, as she had been each evening since their conversation about the money. She was sitting on the couch, her face pale, eyes wary as she watched him enter. "David, what happened?" Lila asked softly, her voice tinged with anxiety. "Is everything okay?" David didn't answer right away. He couldn't. Instead, he walked over to the window, staring out at the city lights, his thoughts racing. Could he still trust her? Could he really believe that she was trying to make things right? Or was this just another layer of deceit? "Angela told me something today," David began, his voice low. "I need to know the truth, Lila. Not just about the money, not just about the payments. I need to know everything." Lila stood slowly, her face full of apprehension. "David, I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to make you understand." David turned to face her, his heart heavy with the burden of the situation. "Tell me, Lila. Tell me everything." Lila's voice trembled as she spoke. "I've been afraid, David. Afraid of what would happen if I told you the truth. They've been threatening me. And they're not just after me. They're after you, too. If I don't do what they say, they'll hurt us both. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't want you to get dragged back into this mess." David's heart broke at the look on her face. The fear, the guilt, the desperation. He had always known that Lila had been through something difficult, but he hadn't fully understood the depth of it until now. "You've been living like this, all this time?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lila nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I'm sorry, David. I didn't know who else to turn to. I was trying to protect you, and myself." David stood there for a long moment, processing the truth that had been laid out before him. The anger, the betrayal, the sense of helplessness, it was all still there, but now there was something new, something stronger, a choice. David knew the truth now. Lila was caught in a web of fear, and she had been doing everything she could to protect both of them. But he couldn't stand by and let her continue living in fear. He needed to act. "We need to get you out of this," David said, his voice firm. "We can't keep running, Lila. We need a plan." Lila wiped her eyes, hope flickering in her expression. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath. "We need to contact the authorities. We need to get the FBI involved. This has gone far beyond what we can handle ourselves. And if we're going to stop Graham and his people, we need to do it together." Lila's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and relief. "But David, if we go to the authorities, they'll come after us. We'll never be safe." David stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "We'll be safer together. I won't let you face this alone anymore." We'll figure this out. We'll find a way. Lila nodded slowly, her face full of uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. Okay, she whispered. Let's do it. The next morning, David contacted Angela and began putting the pieces in motion. It wasn't going to be easy, but with the right strategy, they could finally bring down the remnants of Graham's empire. It was risky, dangerous work, but it was the only way forward. And as David and Lila began to take those first steps together, towards redemption, towards safety, and towards a future they could build, David realized that love, trust, and bravery weren't just about believing the best in each other. Sometimes, it was about facing the hardest truths together and choosing to move forward, no matter the cost. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, David felt like they might actually have a chance to rebuild. Not just their lives, but their love as well. The fight wasn't over, but this was their fight, and they would face it together. The days after David's decision to confront Graham's network were a blur of tension and strategy. The stakes were higher than ever. David and Lila had barely spoken since their intense conversation the night before, and while there was a glimmer of hope between them, the weight of their past still hung heavy. David had to stay focused. There was no room for distractions now. As he met with Angela and the team of investigators, his mind kept drifting back to Lila. The fear in her eyes, the way she had confessed everything. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying a burden that was too heavy for her to bear alone. It was a burden that might cost them both their lives if they didn't act swiftly. Angela had provided him with the final piece of information they needed. A location where the remnants of Graham's criminal empire were operating. It was a remote warehouse, hidden away on the outskirts of the city, a place that had been used for illegal shipments. David knew this was their chance to end it all, but the plan wasn't without danger. If they did this wrong, it could all come crashing down in an instant. David met with the FBI task force, outlining the operation that would take place within the next 48 hours. Angela was coordinating the investigation from her side, but the plan was clear. Surround the warehouse, cut off any escape routes, and bring in the key players involved in the criminal network. But there was something else, Lila. I don't think it's safe for Lila to be involved directly in the operation, Angela said as they went over the details. We can't take any chances. David clenched his jaw, reluctant to agree, but he knew Angela was right. The last thing he wanted was for Lila to be put in harm's way. He had spent too many nights worrying about her safety. She had already been through enough. But that didn't mean she would stay on the sidelines. Lila was determined to prove she wasn't just a victim anymore. She had lived through the worst of it, and now, she wanted to fight back. David, she had said the night before, I'm not just sitting here waiting for something to happen. I've been a part of this mess, and now I'm going to help end it. We can't just wait around for them to come after us again. David had hesitated, but in the end, he had understood her resolve. She wasn't the woman who had hidden behind fear anymore. She was the woman who wanted to take control, who wanted to fight for her freedom. For both of them. The night before the operation, David sat alone in their apartment, reviewing the plan once more. He could feel the weight of the impending mission pressing down on him. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Lila came into the room, her eyes tired but determined. I'm ready, she said softly. David looked up at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt. Are you sure about this? It's going to be dangerous. I don't want you to get hurt. Lila shook her head. I've already been hurt, David. I'm not afraid of this anymore. I just want it to end. David exhaled deeply, then nodded. Okay, but you stay close to me. We do this together. The night was eerily quiet as they drove to the location. The plan was simple. David and Lila would enter the warehouse with a team of agents in the shadows, but only if everything went smoothly. Angela would remain in communication with them from a secure location, guiding them through each step. As they approached the warehouse, the streets grew quieter, the darkness creeping in. The air was thick with anticipation. David's heart beat faster as they parked at the edge of the perimeter. He could feel the adrenaline beginning to rise within him. They were about to face the unknown. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was tense. David's team moved swiftly, staying low to the ground, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. There were only a few minutes before the operation would commence. Everything had to go according to plan. David and Lila moved silently through the darkened building, every sense on high alert. They hadn't yet spotted anyone, but the air was thick with the presence of danger. Then, just as they neared the center of the warehouse, a noise echoed from the far side. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their faces hard with anger. The situation had escalated faster than David had anticipated. Before he could react, a voice broke the silence. David. The voice was familiar, but chilling. It was Graham's second-in-command, a man named Vincent. He had been the one who had orchestrated much of the network's operations in the city. David had been tracking him for months, and now, here he was, standing before them. "Did you really think you could take down what's mine?" Vincent sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long." David's hand tightened on his gun. "This ends tonight, Vincent." But before the confrontation could escalate further, a voice came from behind Vincent. "Let them go." David froze as Lila stepped forward, her expression cold and determined. Vincent looked confused, then angry. "Lila, what are you doing? You're with him?" Lila took a steadying breath. "I'm not with you anymore, Vincent. I'm not afraid of you or any of your men. This ends now." David's mind was racing. What was Lila doing? Why was she stepping into the line of fire? But just as the tension reached its peak, Angela's voice crackled through David's earpiece. "David, now." In a flash, FBI agents swarmed the warehouse, quickly overwhelming Vincent and his men. The operation was in full swing, and within moments, they had secured the area, arresting those who had been running the operation. Vincent tried to make a break for it, but Lila's quick thinking stopped him. With a few swift movements, she subdued him long enough for the agents to catch up. The dust settled quickly. The warehouse had been cleared, the criminals apprehended, and the remnants of Graham's network were dismantled. It was a victory, but it felt hollow in David's chest. The fight had been won, but the scars remained. David and Lila stood outside the warehouse, watching as the last of the agents loaded evidence into the vans. The air was crisp, but it couldn't wash away the heaviness between them. The truth, no matter how much they had uncovered, had left a mark on both of them. "You did good," David said quietly, turning to look at Lila. "You were brave in there." Lila's lips quivered as she smiled faintly. "I had to be. For both of us." David placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "We're done with this now, Lila. We can start over. We don't have to live in the shadows anymore." Lila nodded slowly, her eyes filled with emotion. "I know. I just need to know that you can forgive me, that we can move past everything." David looked into her eyes, the weight of the past heavy on his heart. But he knew, deep down, that they were on the same path now. There was no going back, only forward. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "We'll build something new. Together." And with that, they stood in the cold night air, the promise of a new beginning hanging between them. The battle was over, but the real work, the work of healing, of rebuilding, and of moving forward, was just beginning. And this time, they would face it as partners. The days after the raid were a blur of press conferences, law enforcement reports, and finally, the release of the people involved in Graham's operation. While the criminal network had been destroyed, the emotional wreckage it had left behind was harder to repair. For David and Lila, the victory felt both liberating and heavy. They had faced a deadly enemy together, but the aftermath brought a fresh wave of emotions they hadn't expected. David had spent the last few days tied up in legal matters, making sure that the authorities had all the information they needed to keep the criminals behind bars. Meanwhile, Lila was dealing with the lingering trauma of her involvement in the ordeal. The memories, the fear, and the sense of being used like a pawn by Graham's associates weighed heavily on her. As much as she tried to reassure David that she was okay, he knew she wasn't. It wasn't just the physical scars she had to heal from. It was the emotional toll, the shattered sense of trust, and the remnants of the fear that had kept her up at night. Lila had always been the strong one, or at least, that's how David had seen her in the beginning. But now, it felt as though she was fading. He could see the emptiness in her eyes when she stared into the distance, lost in thoughts that he couldn't reach. It made his heart ache. She had faced so much, far more than he could ever truly understand, but she had never shown how deeply it had hurt her until now. One evening, as the two of them sat in their living room, the silence stretched uncomfortably between them. Lila sat on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around them as if trying to hold herself together. David had been staring at the paperwork in front of him, but it was the quiet that made his skin prickle. He couldn't ignore it any longer. "Lila," he started, his voice soft. "We need to talk. Really talk." Lila turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting his. Her lips parted, as though she was preparing to say something, but she quickly closed them again. "About what?" David set the papers aside, focusing entirely on her. "About everything. About what happened, how you're feeling, what comes next. This isn't just over because the bad guys are in jail. I know you're carrying a lot of weight inside you." Lila looked away, her throat tightening. "I don't know how to let go of it, David. I keep thinking about everything I did to protect you, how I lied to you, how I let myself get pulled back into that world, thinking I could handle it. And now," her voice broke, and she wiped her eyes quickly, trying to hide the tears. "And now, I don't know who I am anymore." David's heart broke at her words. She was lost, drowning in the guilt of her choices, her survival tactics, and the life she had once tried to leave behind. He moved to sit next to her, gently placing a hand on hers. "Lila, you're not that person anymore. You made mistakes, but you also did everything you could to survive, to protect both of us. It's going to take time, but you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." Lila met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if I can't let go? What if the past follows me forever?" David squeezed her hand. "We can't change what happened, but we can control what we do now. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself anymore. I'm here, Lila. We'll heal, piece by piece." She nodded slowly, as though his words were just starting to sink in. The weight wasn't something that would disappear overnight, but with time, with effort, they could rebuild what had been broken. The weeks that followed were both difficult and rewarding. Lila began attending therapy, though she still struggled with fully opening up. She wanted to move on, but the fear of slipping back into the shadows kept her from embracing the present fully. David supported her every step of the way, even if it meant taking a back seat to her healing process. As time passed, they began to talk more openly about their fears, their desires, and the future they both wanted to build. It wasn't always easy. Some days, Lila would retreat into herself, overwhelmed by the scars that ran deep. But David was patient. They both were. Healing was not a linear process, but it was progress nonetheless. One night, as the sun set over the city, David and Lila took a walk through the park near their apartment. It had become their tradition, an escape from the chaos of their lives, a way to reconnect and just be together, away from everything else. Lila was silent as they walked side by side, her fingers brushing against David's. She seemed lost in thought, but David knew it wasn't a bad kind of silence. They had come to understand each other in ways that words couldn't always explain. Sometimes, just being near each other was enough. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" David asked, breaking the quiet. Lila looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Every day," she replied softly. "But I'm starting to believe that what happens next is up to us. We get to decide." David smiled, his heart swelling with hope. He had once thought their future was uncertain, clouded by the past. But now, it felt like a new chapter was beginning. A chapter where they could create something better, something all their own. The months that followed the raid were filled with small victories and growing pains. David and Lila worked together to rebuild their relationship, slowly and steadily. They moved past the pain, one step at a time, learning to trust again, learning to forgive, not just each other, but themselves. David knew that there would always be a part of Lila that would carry the scars of what had happened, but it no longer defined her. It no longer defined them. Together, they were building something new, something stronger, something built on the truth, trust, and love they had fought so hard to find. And while the past would always be there, like a shadow in the distance, David knew they had the power to shape their future. They had faced the darkness together and had come out on the other side, stronger than ever. As they stood at the edge of their new life, hand in hand, David whispered, "We made it, Lila. We're going to be okay." Lila squeezed his hand, her smile brighter than it had ever been. "We're more than okay, David. We're free." And with that, they walked into their future, together, stronger, and ready for whatever came next. Though David and Lila had finally started to find peace, the past they had fought so hard to escape wasn't quite done with them yet. Just when they thought they had outrun the danger, an unexpected turn of events would throw everything into jeopardy again. It started subtly, like a whisper in the wind, but soon it would grow louder, much louder. It was an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind David and Lila had come to cherish after months of chaos. They had just finished dinner, the quiet hum of their apartment making them feel like everything was normal again. Lila was in the kitchen, tidying up, when David's phone rang. He looked at the screen. The name flashed in bold letters, Angela. His heart skipped a beat. They hadn't spoken much since the bust, but Angela had been a critical ally in taking down Graham's operation. He answered, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of concern. "Angela? What's going on?" "David." Angela's voice was tight. Her words rushed. "You need to listen to me. Something's happening, and it's bigger than we thought." David's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean? What's happening?" "I just got word from an inside source. Graham's network isn't gone. We thought we wiped it out, but there are remnants, rogue elements still operating. They've resurfaced, and they're targeting you." David's mind raced. "Targeting me? Why?" "There's a new player in town. Someone connected to Graham, someone who's been working in the shadows, staying off the radar. They know everything about you, David, about Lila too. They're planning something, and it's not just about revenge anymore. It's personal." David's heart sank. "Lila!" The name barely escaped his lips. Angela's voice softened. "David, I know this is hard, but you need to be ready. They're coming for both of you. And this time, they're not playing by the same rules." After hanging up with Angela, David sat in stunned silence for a moment. The world had seemed to be settling, finally. They had won, hadn't they? They had faced the worst of it. But now, it seemed that victory had only been temporary. The battle wasn't over. Lila appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She noticed his somber expression and immediately stopped in her tracks. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. David looked up at her, his jaw tight. "Angela just called. The network, it's not finished. We're not safe, Lila." Lila's face went pale. She had barely begun to heal from everything they had been through, and now, it seemed like the past was catching up with them faster than she could keep up. "We need to prepare," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to take this seriously. They know everything about us, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Lila swallowed hard, her fists clenching. "What do we do? How do we stop them this time?" David shook his head. "I don't know yet, but we'll do whatever it takes." In the following days, David and Lila took every precaution. They changed their routine, installed extra security at their apartment, and kept a constant watch over their surroundings. David contacted Angela again, urging her to dig deeper into this mysterious new figure who had emerged from the ashes of Graham's empire. Angela's investigation led her to a man named Marcus Steele. He had been one of Graham's right-hand men, a ghost in the system who had vanished after the raid. Marcus was ruthless, cunning, and cold, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd and never draw attention to himself. But now, he was back, and he had a vendetta. Through Angela's connections, David learned that Marcus had been responsible for coordinating the last-minute escapes and money laundering operations that had kept Graham's empire afloat. With Graham gone, Marcus had taken control of the remnants of the operation and was looking to build it back up, starting with David and Lila. The fact that Marcus knew so much about them was what worried David the most. It was clear that this man wasn't just after power. He was after revenge. And revenge, as David had learned, could drive a person to do terrible things. It didn't take long for Marcus to make his move. One night, as David and Lila were returning home from a late dinner, they were ambushed. It happened so quickly that David barely had time to react. A black SUV pulled up beside them, and men in dark clothing spilled out, their faces masked. Before David could pull Lila out of harm's way, the attackers swarmed them. David fought back instinctively, but the numbers were against them. One of the men grabbed Lila, yanking her into the vehicle with such force that she cried out in pain. David was left struggling against the remaining attackers. He fought desperately, managing to land a few solid blows, but it was clear they were outmatched. In the chaos, he caught a glimpse of one of the men's faces, a familiar face. Marcus Steele. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Marcus had come for them, just as Angela had warned. This was no longer about power or money. It was personal. And now, Marcus had Lila. David's pulse raced as the men dragged Lila into the SUV and sped off into the night. The world around him blurred, and he was consumed by one thought: getting her back. He had promised her that they would be safe, that the worst was behind them. But now, the nightmare had returned. He jumped into his car, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. Angela had given him a tracker, but it was a long shot. Marcus knew how to cover his tracks, and the chances of finding Lila in time were slim. But David had no choice. He wasn't going to lose her again. His phone buzzed. Angela's name appeared on the screen. "David," she asked, breathless. "I'm tracking their movements. I know where they're going. You need to follow my lead." David's heart raced as he listened to Angela's instructions. She had found Marcus' hideout, an old warehouse on the edge of town, abandoned and hidden from prying eyes. David's grip on the wheel tightened. This was it, the final confrontation. As David arrived at the warehouse, he saw the black SUV parked out front. His heart thudded in his chest, and adrenaline surged through his veins. He wasn't alone. Angela's team had arrived, ready to back him up. David's eyes darted around the warehouse. There was no turning back now. Inside, Marcus and his men were waiting, prepared for the showdown that David had long feared. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about finishing the fight once and for all. And this time, David wasn't going to let them win. The warehouse was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes every footstep feel louder, every breath feel more deliberate. David's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched behind a stack of crates with Angela's team. They had come prepared, guns, tactical gear, and a determination to see this through. But this wasn't just about firepower. This was personal. Lila was inside, and he would do anything to get her back. David's hand shook as he adjusted his grip on the gun. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even sure if he was ready for what was coming. But Lila was counting on him. He couldn't fail her now. "Ready?" Angela whispered, her voice low but steady. David nodded, taking a deep breath. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he had no choice. They moved quickly and quietly toward the entrance of the warehouse. The air was thick with tension as they approached the door, their footsteps muffled on the cracked concrete floor. Angela motioned to two of her men to flank the sides of the building while David and she crept forward. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every corner could conceal an enemy. But David's focus was solely on the inside, on finding Lila. As they breached the door, the first thing that hit David was the dim, flickering light from overhead. The warehouse smelled of rust and oil, the air stale. It felt like a place where lives could easily be lost. He could hear voices, low, muffled conversations, echoing from the far end. Angela signaled for them to split up. David and she took one path, while the others went in the opposite direction. They moved stealthily, staying low, listening for any signs of danger. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking open made David freeze. He crouched down, his breath shallow, and gestured for Angela to stay still. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, wearing a dark hoodie and gloves, moving cautiously toward the center of the warehouse. David's instincts kicked in. He couldn't afford to wait. The man hadn't noticed them yet, but David wasn't willing to take any chances. In a swift motion, David tackled the man to the ground, pinning him down before he could shout. Angela quickly subdued another man who had appeared behind them. The quiet chaos of the moment was deafening as they secured the two men, stripping them of their weapons. David grabbed the first man by the collar, pulling him up to his feet. "Where is she? Where is Lila?" he demanded. his voice cold and controlled, though his heart raced. The man sneered, but fear flickered in his eyes. "You're too late," he spat. "She's already with Marcus." David's stomach dropped. Marcus was already ahead of them, but he wasn't backing down. He slammed the man against the wall. "Tell me where they are, or I'll make you wish you had never crossed me." The man laughed bitterly. "You think you can stop him? Marcus is a ghost. He's always one step ahead." Angela moved to David's side. "We don't have time for games," she said, pulling David back. "We need to move." David glanced at the man one last time. "You're lucky you're not worth my time." They left him behind, moving deeper into the warehouse. As they advanced, the sound of muffled voices grew louder. Then, suddenly, David froze. He could hear Lila's voice. She was yelling. His heart raced as he recognized the fear and panic in her tone. "Lila!" he called out, desperation slipping into his voice. "David!" Her voice cracked as she screamed his name. "Help me!" The sound was enough to propel David forward. He rushed toward her voice, and Angela followed closely behind. Finally, they found the room where Marcus had been hiding. The door was ajar, and inside, David saw her. Lila was tied to a chair, her face bruised and bloodied, but her eyes were locked on David's with a mixture of relief and terror. Marcus was standing in front of her, his back to the door, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he held a gun to her head. Well, Marcus said, turning slowly as he heard the footsteps. "Look who finally showed up. You really thought you could escape this, David? You've made too many enemies, and now your little wife is going to pay for it." David's blood boiled. "Let her go, Marcus," he said, his voice low and controlled. "This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with this." Marcus laughed darkly, the sound echoing through the room. "Oh, but she has everything to do with this. She's the one thing that still ties you to this world. You think you're safe, but you're not. Not anymore." The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus's eyes flicked between David and Lila, his finger resting on the trigger. David's mind raced, trying to find a way to disarm Marcus without getting Lila hurt. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also something else. Strength, determination. She was still fighting. David took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't take Marcus down with brute force alone. The room was too small, the risks too high. He needed a strategy. He needed to outsmart Marcus. With a sudden movement, David lunged forward, grabbing a metal rod from a nearby workbench. Marcus's gun was raised, but David was quicker. He swung the rod, knocking the gun out of Marcus' hand. The sound of metal striking flesh was deafening, and Marcus staggered backward, momentarily disoriented. Angela rushed in, subduing one of Marcus's remaining men who had been hiding near the door. The rest of the team burst into the room, forcing Marcus to retreat toward the corner. David advanced, his fists clenched, rage boiling inside him. "This ends now." Marcus's smirk faded as he realized the fight was lost. He raised his hands in mock surrender, but David wasn't fooled. He wasn't going to let this man get away again. David stepped closer, his voice cold as ice. "You don't get to win. Not this time." With one final blow, David knocked Marcus to the ground, the sound of the impact echoing in the warehouse. The authorities arrived soon after, securing the warehouse and taking Marcus and his men into custody. Lila was untied, and David wrapped her in his arms as soon as she was free. The relief was overwhelming, but it didn't come without its cost. Both of them had been through too much, and the emotional scars would take time to heal. As they left the warehouse, hand in hand, David knew the danger was over, for now. But more than that, he knew they had survived the impossible. And together, they would rebuild. They would find peace. Lila looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "We made it. Together." David squeezed her hand. "We always will." The days following the showdown were a blur of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and a newfound sense of peace that David and Lila had long been searching for. As the dust settled, the aftermath of their harrowing experience left them both questioning what their next step would be. The threat of Marcus and his associates was over, but the scars, both physical and emotional, lingered. They had survived, but the journey to healing had just begun. It was a quiet morning when they finally had time to breathe. The world outside felt strangely calm, the usual hustle and bustle of their city seeming miles away. David and Lila were sitting on the balcony of their apartment, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise together. The gentle light bathed their faces, warming them both in a way that felt like a new beginning. Lila turned to David, her fingers gently brushing his hand. "Can you believe it's over? After everything?" David met her gaze, his eyes soft with a mix of disbelief and relief. "It feels surreal, but it's done. And now we can finally move forward. We can rebuild our lives, without looking over our shoulders." Lila nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I just want things to be normal again. A life without constant fear." David smiled, the weight of the last few months starting to lift from his shoulders. "We'll get there. I promise. One step at a time." They sat in silence for a moment, just enjoying the calm and the comforting presence of each other. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed like a place filled with hope. As the weeks passed, they slowly began to reintegrate into the world outside their bubble. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard, and both of them found themselves checking over their shoulders from time to time, certain that danger was just around the corner. But as they reconnected with friends and began to rebuild the relationships that had been fractured during the chaos, they began to feel like themselves again. David started working with Angela, helping to bring down the last of the rogue elements in Marcus's network. Though his days as a fugitive were over, the work wasn't finished. They had to make sure that every last thread of Graham's operation was untangled, and that no one else would fall into Marcus's trap. But this time, it was on their terms, and they did it with the support of the authorities, who had finally caught up with the trail of criminals left behind. Meanwhile, Lila found solace in returning to her passion for art. She had always dreamed of opening her own studio, and now, with the weight of the past lifted, she finally took the steps to make that dream a reality. She poured her emotions into her work, creating pieces that reflected not only her journey but the resilience she had gained from it. One afternoon, as they were cleaning up the last remnants of their chaos-ridden past, they received a letter. It was unexpected and came from a source they had not heard from in a long time. An old friend, someone they had once trusted with their lives. It was from Sam, a former colleague of David's. Sam had been part of their crew years ago, someone who had always been loyal but had vanished when the heat started to rise. David had wondered about him, whether he was alive, or if he had become another casualty of the world they'd been forced to leave behind. The letter was brief but filled with meaning. Sam wrote that he had been watching from afar, tracking their progress, and he wanted to help them. He had been involved in dismantling some of Marcus's former operations and had information that could ensure their safety moving forward. Sam offered them a fresh start, a chance to truly leave behind the past and forge a future without looking over their shoulders. David and Lila met with Sam at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Sam looked different, older, more weathered, but his eyes still held the same fire that had driven him all those years ago. Over coffee, Sam explained that he had spent the last few years rebuilding his life in the shadows. He had stayed low, avoiding any connections that might lead back to Marcus or the remnants of Graham's empire. "I watched you both go through hell," Sam said, his voice serious. "And I know you're tired, but this world isn't finished with you yet. But I can give you the tools to protect yourselves. No one will find you again. No one will hurt you." David was skeptical at first, but after hearing Sam's plan, he realized that this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. A chance to disappear entirely, to finally leave behind the darkness that had followed them for so long. They agreed to take Sam's offer, knowing it would mean severing all ties with their old life. But it was a price they were willing to pay, for a life of peace, safety, and, hopefully, happiness. With Sam's help, David and Lila moved far away from the city, to a quiet town nestled in the mountains. It was a place no one knew, where the only noise was the rustling of leaves in the wind. They bought a small cottage on the edge of a forest, far from the chaos of their past. It wasn't much, but it was enough, a place to start over. David took up work as a consultant, using his skills to help local businesses with security. He still kept in touch with Angela, but the frequency of their communication had slowed. The world they had once been a part of felt distant now, like a dream they had woken from. Lila turned the small shed on their property into a studio, where she spent her days creating art that reflected the peace she had found. It was in these moments, as she painted the landscape that surrounded them, that she felt truly at home. Her work became more than just a hobby. It was a therapy, a way to express the healing she had gone through, and it was in the colors of her art that she found clarity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David and Lila sat on the porch of their cottage, watching the sky change from gold to purple. The world felt right, and for the first time in a long while, they could imagine a future that was theirs to shape. There were still uncertainties, still the memories of the past that haunted their dreams, but they had found something far more important: hope. "We made it," Lila said softly, leaning her head on David's shoulder. "We really did." David kissed the top of her head, his hand resting on hers. "We did. And now, we get to live." As the night settled around them, David and Lila knew they had earned their peace. The world may have tried to break them, but together, they had come out stronger. And now, in this quiet corner of the world, they would write the next chapter of their lives, one filled with love, growth, and the promise of tomorrow. Months passed in their new life. The cottage in the mountains became a sanctuary, one where David and Lila could finally embrace peace. Yet, as with any peace, it was fragile. The tranquility they had fought so hard to achieve seemed almost too perfect. The fear of what had been, of the men who had nearly destroyed them, still lingered in the back of David's mind. David found himself often staring into the distance, his thoughts far away. Though he kept busy with his new consulting work, there was always the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Even in their isolated little town, it was hard to shake the feeling that the past was never really behind them. Lila noticed the change. She saw the way David would sometimes grow distant, his brow furrowing as if something were haunting him. It worried her. The trauma they had experienced had left its mark on both of them, but she could see the weight it placed on David more than anyone else. His loyalty, his protective instincts, had always been what had kept them together. But now, it was as if something inside him was holding back. One evening, as the two of them walked through the forest near their home, Lila took his hand, stopping him mid-step. "David," she began, her voice soft but insistent. "You're not okay. I can see it." David's gaze shifted to the horizon, the last traces of daylight fading into the night. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice didn't match the words. Lila knew him too well to be fooled. "No, you're not. What's really going on?" David sighed deeply, sitting on a fallen log nearby. He looked up at the trees above, the shadows creeping around them in the growing dark. "It's not that simple. I keep thinking that one day, Marcus's people might come for us. That no matter how far we run, they'll find us again." Lila kneeled in front of him, placing her hands gently on his. "But you're not that man anymore. We aren't those people. We're free, David. We can finally breathe. You have to let go of what you can't control." David's eyes flicked to hers, and for a brief moment, he saw the same fear she had once lived with. But now, there was also the strength of someone who had survived. "I'm scared, Lila," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "What if we're never really safe? What if this is just temporary?" Just as David and Lila were beginning to settle back into a routine, a knock on the door shattered the illusion of safety they had created. It was late afternoon, the sky still bathed in warm hues of orange and red, when David opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man, grizzled, weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was Sam. David froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Sam? What are you doing here?" Sam's expression was grim. "I'm sorry to drop in like this, but we need to talk. It's important." David glanced at Lila, who had come to the door behind him. Her eyes widened in recognition, though she too was visibly unsettled by his sudden appearance. "What happened?" David asked, stepping aside to let Sam in. His heart was already pounding, knowing that Sam's presence wasn't a good sign. Sam didn't waste time. As soon as he was inside, he spoke in hushed tones, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "There's been a change. Marcus's people, they're still out there. We thought they were finished, but we were wrong. They're looking for you, David. They don't forget." David's face hardened, the old tension returning to his muscles. He had been hoping, praying that this time, things would be different, that they could finally live without looking over their shoulder. "Why now?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "Why after all this time?" Sam looked between them, his face etched with concern. "I don't know all the details, but there's been some movement. The people who were supposed to stay quiet, some of them, they're still loyal to Marcus. And they know you're out here. They know you've been living under the radar." David clenched his fists, his mind racing. "What do we do?" Sam hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I came here because I owe you both. I want to help, but this time, it's not going to be easy. We need to prepare. I can't promise that we can stop them, but I can help you stay one step ahead." David's instincts flared. He trusted Sam. He had always trusted him. But this new threat felt like it had come from nowhere. He had thought it was over, but it wasn't. That night, after Sam left to give them some space, David and Lila sat together, trying to process what had just happened. The warm, familiar comfort of their home felt different now, tinged with unease and dread. They had come so far to build this life, to leave behind the dangers of their past, but now it seemed as though the shadows were catching up. Lila spoke first, breaking the silence that hung heavily in the room. "David, we can't live like this forever. We can't be afraid all the time. We've fought so hard to be free, and now we have to decide if we're going to keep running or if we're going to fight back." David nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He had always been a protector, someone who fought for those he loved. But this was different. This time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about taking control of their future, no matter the cost. "You're right," he said, meeting her gaze. "We've run enough. It's time we finish this." The next few weeks were spent preparing. Sam stayed with them, helping them fortify their home, making sure there were escape routes and places to hide if things went wrong. He was working behind the scenes, gathering information and strengthening their defenses. Angela had also reached out, offering her help and resources from her network. David knew they weren't ready for what was coming, but they would never be ready if they kept running. It was time to face the ghosts of their past, and with Lila by his side, he was willing to do whatever it took. But in the back of his mind, the fear was still there. Would this fight ever truly end? Or would they be doomed to run forever? As David and Lila prepared for what was to come, they knew the road ahead would be dangerous. But they also knew that together, they had a chance. A chance to finally take control of their lives. A chance to make the future their own. The storm was coming, but they would face it together. And this time, they would not run. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. They had faced danger before, but this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about putting an end to the constant threat that had followed them for far too long. The shadow of Marcus and his men loomed over them like an unrelenting storm, but David and Lila had made a decision. They weren't going to run anymore. They were going to fight back. With Sam's help, they had fortified their little cottage, adding security measures that were both subtle and effective. Cameras, motion sensors, and escape routes were mapped out with precision. While David was focused on the defensive side of things, Lila's talents as an artist came in handy in disguising some of the modifications they made to their home. It wasn't just about protection. They wanted to feel like they hadn't completely surrendered their lives to the past. Still, there was no denying the tension in the air. The calm of their home, the serenity they had worked so hard to build, felt fragile now. Every sound, every movement felt like it could signal the beginning of something far more dangerous. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Sam came to them with an update. His face was tight, his eyes shadowed with concern. "They're close," he said. "I've tracked a few of Marcus's men, and they're moving in your direction." David's stomach tightened at the news. "How close?" Sam hesitated for a moment, scanning the room. "Too close. We need to move now." The three of them gathered around the table, a map of the area spread before them. Sam had brought in some help, a few trusted allies who had agreed to assist in the fight. It was time to get serious. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would lead Marcus's men into an ambush, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Marcus doesn't know this area, Sam explained, his finger tracing the map. We can use the forest and the cliffs to our advantage. We'll set up false trails, make them think we're one step ahead. When they come looking for us, we'll have the upper hand. David nodded, his mind racing. We can't afford to make mistakes. If we do this wrong, we could end up in even worse danger. Lila, who had been quiet until now, looked at David with determination. I'm in. I'm ready for this. We've come too far to back down now. David met her gaze, seeing the fire in her eyes. For a moment, the past weeks of uncertainty and fear vanished. He saw the woman he loved, the woman who had stood by him through everything. He knew, in that moment, they were stronger together than apart. The day of the operation arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. As planned, they set up their position in the heart of the forest, waiting for Marcus's men to make their move. Every second felt like an eternity. David's nerves were on edge, but he stayed focused, his military instincts taking over as he prepared for the worst. Lila stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We'll make it through this," she whispered, trying to reassure him as much as herself. David gave her a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We will. Together." Hours passed, and the silence of the forest grew heavier. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the distant chirp of birds. But soon, that silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. "They're here," Sam whispered urgently, his hands signaling the others to take their positions. David's heart raced as he crouched behind a thick oak, his eyes scanning the underbrush for any sign of movement. His mind was alert, every muscle tensed and ready for action. The plan had to work. Suddenly, a group of men appeared through the trees, moving with the precision of soldiers. They were close, too close. David's pulse quickened, his instincts telling him this was the moment. It was now or never. At Sam's signal, the trap was sprung. They triggered a series of distractions, loud noises, falling branches, and smoke bombs that obscured the sight lines. The men stumbled back, disoriented by the sudden chaos. That's when David and the team moved in. The fight was intense, quick, brutal, and loud. David was a blur of motion, his combat training taking over as he engaged with the nearest enemy. He fought with a precision that came from years of experience, his mind calculating every move, every strike. Lila, too, was not just standing by. She was moving with purpose, covering their retreat, ensuring they wouldn't be outflanked. Sam was a shadow in the background, directing the operation and taking down targets with cold efficiency. It was like an intricate dance, a carefully orchestrated battle where each move mattered, and failure was not an option. Just as they thought they had the upper hand, something unexpected happened. From the shadows, a larger group of men appeared, led by someone David had not anticipated, Graham. David froze as Graham stepped forward, a smug smile on his face. "Did you really think you could escape me?" he sneered, the words carrying the weight of years of hatred. Graham had been a ghost for so long, and now, here he was, standing right in front of them. "You thought Marcus was the only threat? You haven't seen anything yet," Graham taunted. David's blood ran cold. This was the man who had been the mastermind behind their entire nightmare, the man who had set everything in motion. And now, he was here, in the flesh, ready to finish what Marcus had started. David's heart raced. "You're a fool, Graham. You've been hiding in the shadows for too long. It's over." Graham chuckled darkly, drawing his weapon. "You really think it's over? This game has only just begun." The forest seemed to hold its breath as the two men faced each other, the tension palpable in the air. David's grip tightened around his weapon, but just before the fight could escalate, a sharp shout broke the silence. "Move!" The call came from Sam, and in that instant, everything changed. A massive explosion rocked the ground, sending debris flying. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the blast scattered the enemy forces. David and Lila were thrown to the ground, disoriented but alive. When the smoke cleared, Sam stood, covered in dirt but triumphant. The ambush had been a success, but the real battle was far from over. Graham was still out there, and the final showdown was looming. David looked at Lila, his heart heavy but resolute. This isn't finished yet. We're not done. Lila nodded, her voice firm. We'll finish it. Together. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, David felt hope creeping back in. This time, they wouldn't just survive. They would win. The explosion had left the forest in a haze, the scent of smoke and charred earth hanging in the air. Despite the chaos of the ambush, David and Lila moved swiftly, checking their surroundings for any immediate threats. The enemy had been disoriented, but there was no doubt they would recover quickly. The battle was far from over, and the true test was just beginning. The explosion had been strategically placed, timed perfectly to throw the enemy into disarray. Sam, though shaken by the force of the blast, was already moving toward the wreckage. He knew the fight wasn't won yet, and they had to keep their momentum. David helped Lila to her feet, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The smoke was still thick, but it was beginning to clear, and in the distance, he saw the faint silhouette of Graham disappearing behind the trees. The real enemy had made his move, and David couldn't afford to waste time. "We need to get after him," David said, his voice low and urgent. "Graham's not just any enemy. He's the one pulling the strings. If we don't stop him now, we may never get another chance." Lila nodded, determination in her eyes. "Let's go." The pursuit was relentless. They knew Graham well enough to understand that he wouldn't go down without a fight. He was cunning and ruthless, a master of manipulation, and the one person who could bring everything they had fought for crashing down. The forest was dense and the terrain rugged, but David's military training gave him an edge. He led the way, with Sam covering their rear. The air was thick with tension, and every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes put them on edge. Hours passed, and their trail became harder to follow. Graham was good, too good, but David refused to give up. He knew this was their final chance to put an end to everything that had haunted them for so long. Lila, ever by his side, kept pace with him. "David, we'll get him. I know we will." David glanced at her, seeing the conviction in her eyes. "I won't let him win. Not after everything we've been through." By nightfall, they reached a secluded cabin deep within the woods. It was old, weathered, and had clearly been abandoned for years. But David could feel it. Graham was inside. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he approached the door, his instinct screaming that they were close. "This is it," Sam whispered, his voice low. David gave a curt nod, signaling for everyone to be ready. They approached the cabin cautiously, checking every angle. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single, flickering lamp in the corner. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and dust, but David's focus was razor-sharp. He knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. And then, from the shadows, Graham emerged. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto David, a wicked smile playing on his lips. "Did you really think you could escape me, David?" Graham's voice was smooth, but there was a hint of madness beneath it. "You've been running for so long, but it's time to face the truth. You can never outrun your past." David took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "You've been hiding in the shadows for too long, Graham. It ends tonight." Lila stood beside David, her posture strong. "You won't win this time." Graham laughed, the sound echoing through the cabin. "You think you've won? You think you've gotten away from me? You've always been my pawn, David. You just don't realize it yet." David's heart pounded in his chest. He had faced many enemies in his life, but this was different. Graham wasn't just a threat to his survival. He was a reminder of everything David had once been, the man he had tried to leave behind. "You're wrong," David said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not your pawn anymore." The room erupted into chaos. Graham moved quickly, his weapon drawn, but David was faster. Years of training and survival instincts kicked in as he dodged the first shot and closed the distance between them. The cabin became a battleground, David and Graham clashing in a brutal, desperate fight. Lila moved swiftly, staying alert, ready to assist David if necessary. Sam kept watch by the door, ensuring they wouldn't be ambushed by any additional forces. Every second felt like an eternity, the the sounds of fists hitting flesh and the grunts of exertion filling the air. David and Graham collided again, each struggling for dominance. But this time, David was fueled by something more than just survival. He was fighting for his future, for Lila, and for the life they had worked so hard to build. Finally, with a move that had taken every ounce of his energy, David disarmed Graham, forcing him to the ground. The fight was over. Graham lay on the floor, panting, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You're nothing without me. You'll never be free." David stood over him, breathing heavily but steady. "I'm not your pawn, and I never will be again." With Graham incapacitated, the danger was far from over. They had to make sure he couldn't escape or retaliate. Sam moved quickly, securing Graham and ensuring he wouldn't be a threat any longer. David walked over to Lila, his heart still racing from the intensity of the fight. She looked at him, her eyes full of relief, but also a deep understanding of the weight of what they had just done. "We did it," Lila said softly, her voice filled with emotion. David nodded, but there was no triumph in his expression. "It's over. For now." But deep down, he knew that this victory came at a cost. The ghosts of their past would never fully disappear, but they had taken control of their future. And in that moment, he realized something. No matter how many battles they fought, it was their love, their strength together, that would always be their greatest weapon. As they left the cabin, the cool night air greeted them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David allowed himself to breathe. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face whatever came next. Together, with Graham in custody and the immediate threat neutralized, David, Lila, and Sam knew that their journey was far from over. But they had survived the storm, and with each step forward, they were reclaiming their lives, one day at a time. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter what, they would face it together. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the quiet, still forest. It was a peaceful morning, the kind that David had almost forgotten existed. After everything they had been through, it felt like a blessing to wake up without the weight of danger hanging over them. The past few days had been a whirlwind, filled with confrontation and conflict, but now there was a brief moment of respite. David stood on the porch of their cabin, staring out at the horizon. The world seemed different now. The air was crisp, the sky clear. It felt like the calm after a storm, a rare and precious moment to collect himself. Beside him, Lila joined him, her hand slipping into his. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was all the reassurance he needed. "Hard to believe it's finally over," David murmured, almost to himself. Lila squeezed his hand. "For now, at least. We've earned this moment." David nodded, his gaze lingering on the distant trees. He was still processing everything. The fight, the close calls, and the betrayal from people he had once trusted. But now, it was behind them. They had confronted their worst fears and survived. And the future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. The next few weeks were a time of healing. They stayed at the cabin, making sure everything was secure and finalizing plans for the future. Graham was being held in custody, and with his capture, many of the threats that had followed them for so long seemed to dissipate. David and Lila found themselves rebuilding, not just their lives, but their connection. The trauma of the past had left its scars, but it had also brought them closer together. They shared quiet mornings like this one, enjoying the simple pleasures they had once taken for granted. Sam visited often, helping them repair the property and occasionally offering a hand when things felt too overwhelming. The bond they shared was unspoken but strong. They had been through hell together, and now they were finding their way back to peace. One evening, as David and Lila sat by the fire, the crackling of the wood filling the air, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked softly. David considered her question for a moment before replying. "Every day. But I think we've earned the right to just be for a while. After everything we've been through, we've earned the peace, the quiet. We've fought so hard to just survive. Now it's time to live." Lila smiled, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire. "And what does living look like to you?" David took a deep breath, The answer coming easily. Living looks like this. Like us. Like finding joy in the small things. Building something lasting. Something that can't be taken away. We've spent so long running. I want to spend the rest of my life building. Lila's smile deepened, and she moved closer to him, resting her head against his shoulder. I think I'd like that too. Though they had put an end to the immediate danger, David knew they weren't completely free from the shadows of the past. There were still pieces to pick up and new challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next, with Lila by his side. The world outside was still uncertain, but David was no longer afraid. He had his life, his future, and most importantly, he had Lila. Together, they would face whatever came next, but this time, they would do it on their own terms. As time passed, David and Lila's story became one of renewal. They opened a small business in the town nearby, something quiet and personal, a reflection of the life they had fought so hard to create. Sam occasionally stopped by, and they kept in touch with others who had helped them along the way. But it was the peace they had fought for that gave them the strength to keep moving forward. There would always be scars from the past, reminders of what they had endured, but they no longer defined them. What mattered now was the life they were building together. The future, uncertain and ever-changing, stretched out before them. But with each other, they knew they could face it. Whatever challenges, whatever fears, whatever new battles awaited, they would face them together. And that, David realized, was all that truly mattered. They had survived, and now they would live together, forever.